And you can't even drive? I can. Are you stupid, eh? Are you a stupid fool? Well, why can't you drive then? You can't even drive! A bit grey today, isn't it?
I'm here. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another beautiful week here at the start of spring, the start of another week on Academic Agent. I'm here with Furious. How you doing, Furious?
Evening, everybody. Actually quite wonderful, thank you. It's a lovely change of weather down in the prison colony. As we'll talk about pre-show, I actually was greeted by a kangaroo today, of all things, Australians. So I can't say my week's been bad.
there's even a shot of this encounter that you had.
Yes.
What was this kangaroo up to? He was trying to
eating stone fruit,
stealing fruit. Look, an actual kangaroo.
The last photo's bending over. Oh, sorry.
We do have another guest, Tristan, who is actually a pretty sizable YouTube channel as well. But his mic has basically blown up just before you start going on air, and it sounded like he was sitting in an ambulance. It was just like, it would have been intolerable. So he's going to see if he can find some like old shitty mic to replace his new one, which is for some reason just blown up. So we will he can join us in a bit. Now this was a stream that we did 5-6 weeks ago. 5-6 weeks ago.
About that, yeah. Something like that. It was sort of end of January, I think.
It was called the Vegan Agenda. But we mainly talked about beyond meat and that side of things, whereas today you wanted to talk a little bit more about the longer story, and if we have time, the dreaded seed oils, which if you know anything about Marcus here, he reads about the seed oils on the regular, isn't that right?
Relentlessly. Yes, much to our friend Dee's chagrin, but yes, I do.
Now, just before we get going, what do you mean? I'm sorry, I was late. We're only 2 minutes late. We're on about Fox. We're only 2 minutes. We're only 2 minutes late. Just before we get going, I should mention I released a video not long back, so people could check out, where I was trying to quantify the total number of dissidents. I have another video in the making. Now, I don't want to say that this is WWE style booking, but it is going to be a video taking on what I'm calling the Turley-Dutton thesis. Furious, the breed them out strategy, and why I think this is not a goer, not a good strategy. What Turley and Dutton think will happen is not what will happen for reasons. So I just thought I'd trail that. That's going to be out in the next couple of days as well. All sorts of problems with the breed them out thesis, which I've been thinking about a fair bit recently. Buy my courses, buy a mug, join the channel, subscribe to Substack, etc. Make sure you check out Tristan as well, whether he can join us or not, for more stuff on veganism, and follow the old Pastor Aussie on Twitter if you want. I mean, it's mainly complaining about seed oils and talking to suspiciously attractive women, isn't
it? And my favorite little video clip of that scene from Rome where they're just putting those barbarians on the crucifix whenever I see sort of deviants.
I should also mention I spent the weekend with AAA, as I often do, and she's got a real fixation at the moment on water fountains. water fountains. She's always running after. I take her to this kind of garden centre park thing. And she spends a lot of time scoping out water fountains, opening and closing gates, and generally delighting in the scenery there. So
That's adorable, though.
yes, good fun. She's getting she's almost like, I don't know, but I enjoy. That's why I'm generally in high spirits on Mondays here on Deepest Law, and then as the week progresses, I get more and more miserable until I take her out again on the weekend. So, all right, now let us start at the beginning then on the roots of veganism, on how this became a thing. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, Furious. There is veganism has a longer history than just like current veganism, right? Like, for example, Hindus notoriously do not eat beef. There's a lot of Indians who have like a vegetable diet, only eat fish. Certain strains of Buddhism. Do you want to just address that before we get into the kind of current trajectory that we wanted to talk about? How do you guys address the historical vegans of that nature?
Well, it's actually an interesting critique of the religious aspect of this, because I think we have to make a distinction between, say, for instance, in Western Christianity, predominantly, among Catholics, but I suppose partially true of Anglicans and Protestants too, is that when you go through the Lenten period of 40 days, an aggressive interpretation of Lent is abstaining from red meat for the duration. A kinder interpretation would be refraining from meat on Fridays and to fast, especially on Good Friday. Like you say, there are the strains of Hinduism and Buddhism. Obviously, Indians refrain from eating cows because they believe cows to be a sacred beast, and there's those other sort of practices, like you say, in sort of sects of Buddhism that traverse this similar sort of territory. Now, I think they are of a more sort of sincere philosophical kind of branch of going without in order to appreciate sort of what you have in abundance in good times, or that you sort of learn as an individual some degree of sacrifice or some degree of being able to go with that for a period of time. Therefore, when you have it in abundance, you appreciate it, etc. So and also more of an inclination towards our human understanding of the divine or the transcendental, I suppose, by voluntarily limiting ourselves to these things, which I don't have an opposition with, and I don't think these things are particularly malignant or malevolent in their intent, personally.
Yeah, I mean,
if someone wishes to contend with that, I'd be open to it, but that's my understanding of it.
I mean, the reason I mentioned that is because I think these are the sorts of things that a modern vegan may try to point to for like legitimacy, if that makes any sense. Like, because it seems like it has pedigree if you can point to, Buddha didn't eat meat or whatever. And then the other thing I just wanted to mention right at the top before I let you start your little narrative here is I mean, people who in a lot of these places, if truth be told, India, for example, how much of the veganism is just like de facto because they're just really poor. It's just like a symptom of poverty, and it's just easier to live on agricultural produce, crops, grains, and so on, rice, because it's cheap, versus the problems of having a pasture and raising sheep and so on and so forth. I mean, my understanding is that historically meat has been expensive compared to like grains. Is that true?
That's one of, because that's been discussed before. I think we may have actually got if I remember correctly, I think we got a super chat sort of pertaining to that in the last stream, if memory serves me right. And I hate to be Mr. Nuance here because that can get annoying, but there's a distinction to be made in a couple of ways here. One is I suppose the first answer is yes, but then there would be a distinction between let's take some home territory to understand it better. Let's take the Roman Empire as an example, right? Because that's a field. Well, we all mostly understand the chat here, and it's a field that I specialize in academically. So, in the Roman Empire, for instance, if you lived particularly in Rome, as in the capital city, and in the large cities of the empire, Constantinople, Alexandria, Cordoba, etc. One would have had access if they were sort of what in Rome they called the head count, which was the sort of unlanded, not slaves and not sort of unpersons, let's say, but sort of unlanded citizens who were what we sort of interpret as an urbanite, to use a modern day terminology, right? Would be given access to the grain dole. Or what the British you call a corn dole, but corn and grain is the same thing, right? So the access to the grain dole, in which case you'd have access to flour and or bread, right? And that would be used as a sort of like a baseline survival sort of calorific value for these people so that they didn't starve. And then from that point, they'd be supplemented with whatever they could sort of add to their diet, be it root vegetables, be it cruciferous vegetables, be it things like lettuce or sort of perpetual spinach. A lot of legumes have come from the Americas, so there would have been a lot less in Roman times than now, but sort of what kind of legumes are native to Europe or to Africa would have been consumed sort of back then. And then, as you say, meat would have been, although in fairness, Europeans have, and probably your sort of like the Near East, Iranians and Levantines have probably got a closer relationship to animals in this context, dietically, nutritionally, than other groups that I'm aware of. But and meat would supplement that diet. But say, for example, if I look at where so like my family's from in Italy, I mean, they were from small towns, and a lot of smaller towns outside the big cities, the dynamic would have been probably similar in the sense that if these people owned, I don't know, 5 or 10 acres and lived on a plot of land that they inherited from 5 grandparents removed from them, and they would have had a couple of pigs, they would have had 10 or 20 chickens, or even 5 chickens, whatever. They would have probably had a couple of goats, or between them and their neighbors, they might have shared like a small head of oxen or cows. For instance, I can't remember which Greek writer it was. I got a feeling it was one of the I think it was Megacles, who was basically a friend of Pyrrhus of Epirus, of the infamous Pyrrhic victory, sort of commented that this country, being Italy, was just full of cows. There were just cows everywhere, because Italy had a topography and a geography that was conducive to raising cows. It still is. For a relatively small country, Italy has quite a large cattle sector. So I guess it was a case of where these people resided in the world, what they had access to, what kind of livestock, whether the environment supported particular things. Like, say, for instance, Italy would have a better run with cattle than, say, I don't know, Syria or Lebanon, just on that basis alone. So it's sort of half true what you're saying about, yes, poorer people would have used grains and these sort of things to supplement their diet. But again, there would be a divergence between rural populations and city populations.
Okay, great. So in terms of the current kind of, or the turn against meat in the West in recent modern history, where would you like to start the story, Furious?
Well, I do wish our friend was with us. I hope he can jump on shortly, because he's actually more well-read than what I am in this space. But nonetheless, what can be accounted for is that okay. But when we go to sea dolls, we have some graphs. That's good. Is that for anyone who's familiar with Malthusian theory, and the people who devised that and were proponents of that were essentially Jacobins, right? They were people who had an ideological commitment or an ideological allegiance to the French Revolution, right? And that, as we've spoken about before, in various other fields where you've spoken about industry or trade or, what Charlie would call the realms of the state and all these other sort of social and cultural dynamics that exist. The Jacobins have this obsession with sort of breaking down every single structure that exists in order to like rebuild everything, even to the context of, trying to reinvent the calendar and reinvent time and, for them, everything old, essentially every last trace of the ancien regime has to be dispensed with, and we have to build a new, right? That is the Jacobin mindset, more or less. Would you agree, AA?
Yeah, they wanted to tear down ancient structures, make a new society, utopians. Yeah.
And a part of that is remaking man. And if I don't want to sound too like hippie mum or anything, but we as humans, like through what we eat and what we consume, sort of we replenish ourselves, and we nourish ourselves with the food that we consume, and we are in essence either a product. We are what we eat, or we are what our food eats, which is tipping our hat to the animals that we consume. And ultimately, if one is to have a healthy lifestyle, of which nutrition is a part of that, right, calculus, then you will be a better person by measurable objective standards. You'll be a healthier person. You'll be able to achieve more. You'll be able to live a better life. You'll suffer less chronic illness. You'll suffer less disease. I mean, we're all mortal in the end. That's no one's promising immortality here, but food is an absolute bedrock of being able to live a good, healthy, productive, salubrious life. And the Jacobins, in trying to reinvent the man, have basically weaponized diet, and have weaponized it for a very, very long time. And not to criticize anybody, I don't mean it in this way, but it's not like, Eisenhower had a heart attack in the 50s, and then this guy called Ansel Keys came along and came up with the diet heart hypothesis, and then like everyone in America got obese, and then everyone else in the West got obese a couple of decades later. There's actually a far, far longer, more sort of far-reaching curve to this entire topic than just that, if you know what I mean.
Shall we see if Tristan's mic works? Tristan,
let's do it.
Gentlemen, are we good?
Bingo.
Excellent.
Thank God.
You don't sound like you're in a. You don't sound like you're in an ambulance.
Well, I hate the mic that I'm using. I'm using this piece of crap old, remnant 2016, 17 mic. But you know what? I'm glad I had it, because my other one just died on me. Thank you so much for having me on. Apologies for the tardiness and for the tech issues here. Honestly, I have no idea what happened. My mic that was working great just pooped out on me.
Now, Tristan, before I bring you in again, a lot of people in the chat are saying that chair looks like the sort of chair a vegan would have. Would you like to address that?
Let's see if I'll get this a little bit bigger. This chair. I mean, this is actually a sheepskin, so this would be like I would be sitting on murder from the vegan worldview. From the vegan perspective, this is a murderous display of grotesque human supremacy. Which
a sheep died for that chair,
Now, is there anything? I don't know if you've been able to hear the stuff that Furious has been saying so far. Is there anything that you would add about the very early story here? I asked a little bit about Hindus, ancient Hindus and Buddhists and so on, and we touched on kind of poverty as another kind of reason that people may not have eaten much meat at certain times in the past. And then Furious has mentioned the Jacobins, who had a kind
of Malthusians, yeah.
And now we've got on to Malthus. Now, I have to say, I know Malthus primarily as an economist, because Malthus is actually one of the great opponents of the Austrian school. He didn't know what the Austrian school was, but if you know John Maynard Keynes, Keynes was essentially like a neo-Malthusian, if that makes any sense. So, i.e., almost everything that you could attribute to Keynes in terms of his economic innovations, Malthus was basically making the exact same arguments 100 years previously.
So Malthus was a proto-Keynesian in a sense, sort of pre-Keynes.
Yeah, I mean, or a much simpler way of putting it is that he was an economic protectionist, as was Keynes, of course, and the arguments in economics just kind of go in cycles. So free market dominates for a while, then protectionism dominates for a while, and people need like arguments, and when there's demand for an argument.
Yeah.
There's some intellectual who's going to provide it. The other thing I know about Malthus is that his population arguments, which is what he's famous for today, which is what I'm sure you fellows are going to talk about in a moment, they were actually used as a justification for keeping the what was known as the Corn Laws. Okay, so there was this absolute levy on foreign corn being imported into Britain, and on top of that, there was like a price fix. So corn was extremely expensive, and basically this was justified by, well, actually, we don't want the population to, like, how can I put this? It's like, well, listen, if there's a downturn, and if there's a bad harvest or something, and there's a population boom because people have readily available wheat, but then something happens, then we're going to have like real disaster when they all die again, when there's a famine or something. So better that they're not born in the first place. So it sounds a bit bizarre, but yeah.
Yeah, utilizing essentially sort of like soft economic and sort of like soft social power from government in order to suppress birth rates, essentially, by
Yes.
intentionally curtailing food supply, right?
Yeah, I mean, it was essentially a kind of like I guess you'd say it was a form of eugenics, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, Malthus also one of his ideas was to crowd people into cities and intentionally put them in areas that would breed pestilence and thus more death, so that, in his mind, the strongest would survive. And, the superior genetics, which of course he would be, in his own mind, he is the superior genetics. Whenever you read these people like the Huxleys, the Darwins, the Wedgwood, they believe that they are the supreme beings, that they are the tip of the spear of evolution, that they are, it's therefore their right to kind of drive this evolutionary process. But I think everything you guys mentioned concerning, vegetarianism and the idea of vegetarianism in the ancient world is really relevant. But, and, I think we should always take it to the level of the worldview. And something I've been exploring for years on my channel, both on Rockfin and then on YouTube as well, is the underlying the history of the worldview that has led to this revolutionary ideology that we see so prevalent. And I think it's really important to go back as far as we can, right? Like, I mean, even just in the first millennium, you've got, like, if you read, the church fathers, right? So St. John of Damascus wrote in his book on heresies about many of the groups, basically lists all these Christian heresies from in the first millennium. And many of these groups, including the Nazareans, the Ebionites, the Encratites, they had this idea that eating meat was bad, right? Eating meat is a violation of the laws of nature, right? Eating meat is inherently sinful. And a lot of these cults had the same ones, all the cults that banned the eating of meat also had ideas about marriage and procreation. And this ties into some of the modern vegetarian and vegan cults that have been actually driving dietary policy at the national level in the United States and at the global level as well, right? Just a quote from St. John of Damascus here in On Heresies. He says, the Encratites, who happen to be a branch of the Tatianists, also reject marriage, which they declare to be of Satan, and they forbid all eating of animal foods. Right? So you've got almost every one of these groups that says that eating flesh is bad, also have this kind of Gnostic idea that physical reality is bad, right? And that breeding is inherently bad. And it's interesting how these ideas tie into the revolution, the revolutionaries in the French Revolution. A lot of the revolutionaries had ideas about mass depopulation. If you just get rid of 50% of the population, you're going to have enough bread for everybody. And these same ideas are getting sold to us now, right? If we just become vegetarians, if we will just sterilize ourselves, if we will just live in a coom pod the rest of our lives and, spend our days consuming cockroach milk and, ethically sustainable vegan kibble instead of real foods, then somehow Mother Earth will be happy. There will be this worldly utopia So there's this utopian revolutionary aspect to it all that is sold to us as scientific. It's sold to us as the result of reason and logic, but it's actually at its core metaphysical in nature.
Yeah, no, I should mention something about Malthus in particular, though, because my understanding is, you guys can tell me if you disagree with this, but my understanding is that Malthus, from the data he had and from historical data that you can look at, his essay on the principle of population was basically correct until it wasn't. That is, if you look at the world from, I don't know, let's say like the fall of Rome, or even from Rome to the Industrial Revolution, the Malthusian principle basically holds. But then in the Industrial Revolution, when they were getting like, I think they invented new fertilizers. They had, from memory, new types of automated tractors, combine harvester.
Plant technology was probably one of the biggest advances for that time too.
I remember I wrote a book a couple of years ago when I was looking at the corn laws, and just from the innovations and capital investment alone, they increased like per acre yields by more than 50%, more than 60% in the 1870s. So it was like, well, Malthus and no economist before that time foresaw innovation on that sort of level. So they were going by, well, if you just use traditional methods of farming, if the population outstrips the supply of wheat, you're going to get like a hard, you're going to get a crisis basically, and a depopulation problem. So I just thought I'd mention, like, I'm just trying to be like fair to Malthus, in order to say, like, well, he wasn't like some, like, he wasn't kind of evil in this sense. He had just kind of come up with this principle that was then used to justify keeping the population down, because they didn't actually know that the population that the wheat yields could grow to that level.
Well, I think if you look at it from that perspective, I'm not saying that Malthus had evil intent, but I would say that the underlying assumptions of the worldview do come from a distortion and faulty assumptions of things like uniformitarianism, right, which you mentioned. Like he seemed to be right in this period until there were changes in the way that culture was organized, which allowed more population to exist, right? But I would say that his fundamental assumption that you can extrapolate from looking at fruit flies in a jar and say that, well, all of existence is basically fruit flies in a jar. I'd say that assumption, that it's a materialistic assumption, and it's a kind of the result of Enlightenment thinking, and he's the result of the epoch, the era, and kind of the spirit of the age that he lived within, which I would say had a lot of faulty assumptions that would lead to genocidal worldviews, and ultimately the revolutionary worldview that we saw take over, where everything is up for critique. Everything is to be dominated by man in a complete revolution of all society, all culture, destruction of monarchy, and ultimately a destruction of man himself, who is no longer believed to be made in the image and likeness of God, but is meant to be made in the image and likeness of the will to power of man, is kind of the way I would describe that. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So what happens then later on in the 19th century, when, like, during the period that the Malthusian thesis was actually being disproven, like in real time, by advances in techniques that we talked about? How did it come to pass then that people started turning against meat? Because the other thing I should say about this whole overpopulation debate is that Malthus never stuck a graph up and said the total number of steaks per capita dictates the population. He talked about wheat and bushels of wheat. So how did it like flip over into veganism?
Well, I wouldn't. I mean, I think there's a lot of nuance, and there's a big time period in between that, right? I think looking at the period of the French Revolution is really interesting, right? So I did a stream recently on, I think most of it is on, I think about half of it's on YouTube, and the rest of it is on Rockfin. It was called Blood and Soya. Kind of a play on words there, like soy. Blood and Soya: Veganism and the Revolution, History, Misanthropy, and Useful Idiocy was the name of that stream that you could find on Rockfin. And what I kind of laid out is, where I started talking about earlier, this idea of the revolution being the result of the worldview that became so prominent in the West, and thus, the world, since the West came to dominate most of the temporal world. The revolutionaries in the French Revolution were very influenced by post-Reformation thinking, right? So the Protestant Reformation was really influential on a lot of these revolutionaries. And then ultimately, most of the revolutionaries decided, well, why do we even need Christianity at all, right? Like, instead of just remaking Christianity, let's critique that as well. Let's throw that out the window. We're not made in the image and likeness of God. Where's the evidence for this, right? I see the evidence of the will to power. I see power dynamics in the world is what people started to see the world as. And they started looking to a lot of the pre-Christian world, right? So like this kind of neo-pagan revival, looking for a new vision and like a new way to define the social order and man's place in the cosmos became something that's really important. I think a great book on the revolutionary thinking, and a lot of the audience is probably familiar with this, and Academic Agent and Furious, I think you guys are probably familiar with his work as well. James H. Billington's book, Fire in the Minds of Men. That's a fantastic look at the revolutionary worldview. But you see, they started looking to Pythagoras. They started looking to also, the old gods. Prometheus became kind of the patron of the revolutionaries in many ways, and a lot of them looking to guys like Pythagoras, who Pythagoras also said that meat eating is base. It dirties the soul, right? It prevents union with a higher reality. And ultimately, Pythagoras said that he himself is God, right? So he believed in the transmigration of souls, which this connects back to the Hindu ideas, which seem to come up over and over again in these revolutionary movements. The idea of going back to the pre-Christian world, right? Look what we lost, right? It's kind of this paradise lost vision, but paradise is not the Garden of Eden, where man is in communion with God, which is the classical Orthodox Christian way of seeing paradise and ultimately the eschaton. Their new origin story became about man falling from this golden state in kind of a almost the Platonic Republic, like looking back to like Atlantis, this great period of we were all flourishing. We was kangs. We was we was eating berries out in the woods, and then man started eating meat or something. A lot of them had these ideas. So anyways, they're looking to Plato's Republic, and the revolutionaries were steeped in the occult, right? So you look at guys like Benjamin Franklin, for instance. Benjamin Franklin became a vegetarian, and for years was a vegetarian until he wrote in his diary. There's this funny passage about how he watched he was like watching one of his servants, or I don't know if he owned slaves, but he was watching the help eat some fish, and he was just thinking, this is so barbaric. This is basically murder. So Benjamin Franklin watching his friends eat fish and just judging them and saying meat is murder. I mean, of course, Benjamin Franklin notoriously involved in like the Hellfire Club and these weird granny orgies that they were doing. It's like weird stuff, right? But he was also thinking like, oh, the meat is murder. We're just gonna, if we stop eating meat, we'll have this utopia. He ended
The
up
fish want to live.
Yeah, the fish want to leave. he ends up, the fish want to leave, but then it ends up with, well, Benjamin Franklin also wants to leave. So he got so hungry watching somebody eat fish that he finally gave in and said, you know what? I see when they're butchering the fish that they're eating fish themselves. The fish have little fish inside of them. Therefore, Benjamin Franklin can morally eat fish. So like there's a lot of these strange characters, right? Like John Goodwin Barmby as well, and you had this openly religious vision of communism that very overlooked. And Billington writes about Goodwin Barmby, and a lot of these people had these ideas that would lead to veganism, vegetarianism. Percy Shelley, another atheist materialist who ended up with these ideas. Joseph Ritson was an atheist.
I should mention, Tristan, Shelley, if I can remember from my studies, wrote an epic poem called Prometheus Unbound, which kind of shows you where his head was at,
Yes. So this idea of Prometheus being the ideal archetype figure that we should emulate, imitate. And of course, Prometheus, who's kind of this Luciferian figure stealing fire from the gods. I know people can maybe flesh out the Prometheus story and give the real Prometheus story there a lot better than I can. But the way that it's been mythologized in modern times is basically this Luciferian figure stealing fire from the gods and giving it to people. Freemasonry also, Prometheus, Pythagoras they're coming up over and over again. And so Percy Shelley, Joseph Ritson, who wrote the Robin Hood myth, right, where it was kind of turned into this communist ideology, right, where like Robin Hood steals from the rich, he gives to the poor. Joseph Ritson, who again, you guys mentioned the revolutionary calendar. He adopted this revolutionary calendar as well. And Ritson wrote an essay called Essay on Abstinence from Animal Food as a Moral Duty, right? And he claimed that slavery could be traced back to eating meat, right? So again, they're putting us on the level of animals, which if, looking at it from the Christian worldview, right, where I'm coming from, right, being an Orthodox Christian, that is an inversion of the theology, an inversion of the order that which we see the world. So man becomes on the same level as animals. If you have a cow, that's your slave, and that's mean and it's horrible. A lot of these people, these were privileged class people who were coming up with these ideas, right? The revolutionaries were not serfs and peasants, right? The revolutionaries were decadent, gambling addicts, sex addicts, many of them experimenting with drugs, all sorts of strange lifestyles, and hedonists. So I think when we look at the history of these the revolutionaries, even the Paris Commune, right? Louise Michel, the communard from the Paris Commune in 1871, these ideas of vegetarianism and not eating meat have been tied in with utopianism, revolutionary ideology, and this idea of remaking man and culture into a perfect society. And Malthus's ideas do tie into this to a great degree. And when you see the making of modern dietary guidelines, which have been adopted through organizations like the American Heart Association, through the FDA, the USDA in the United States, and then now the UN, the World Economic Forum, are pushing these very same ideas. This plant-based diet for the planet, for the animals, for mankind, for Mammy Earth, all of these do tie into the revolution, right? The UN and this idea of a world government. This is a revolutionary idea, right? To have a single world government, a global oligarchic kind of control grid where they tie in ideas from communism. They tie in ideas. They sell you on these ideas. Oh yeah, it's like the free market, bro. But really, it's like the worst aspects of communism, the worst aspects of revolutionary capitalism, smashed into one through this kind of dialectic. And food as a method of control, because everything is a method of control to the revolutionary, right? So food as a method of controlling the population growth, controlling people's behavior, is it's not a new idea. It ties back to ancient ideas. Again, Pythagoras said that men who eat meat will become violent. They'll become, their passions will be inflamed. And these same ideas were driving even the Seventh-day Adventists, right? Again, like Protestantism being what I would argue the Protestantism is the grandfathered in revolutionary thinking, right? The radical vision of critique and of a man being the measure of all things, these kind of Renaissance ideas that led to Protestantism, these all kind of form the modern ideology and all kind of tie in together. And diet is a main focus right now of social control, of resource control, resource consolidation, and even transformation of man. So I'm sorry for the long rant. That's kind of laying out. I've got a bunch of notes here from previous stuff that I kind of
just clear something up a second. This Pythagoras thing is interesting because it suggests that there's a kind of Greco-Roman genesis that you can get. I mean, we mentioned Hinduism at the start, but there's like there's a Hellenistic basis, I guess, to some of these arguments. Would I be right in thinking that as on so many other issues, Aristotle was having none of this? I can just imagine Aristotle being like, no, humans are better than animals, eat the meat, men are better than women, etc.
Well, this is the thing you got to think. Aristotle was in part, in some ways, sort of a rebellion against his mentor, who was obviously Plato. There was a fantastic, I don't know if the video's been uploaded or re-uploaded, but there was a fantastic discussion between, because you're friends with, or you've spoken to JF before, haven't you? AO?
Yeah.
As in JF Garipo, yeah. He talked to a guy who is on Twitter, a German fella. I think he's by the name of Anteos is his handle, and he delved into the philosophical roots of, I suppose what we would consider sort of like Jacobinism, egalitarian, like this sort of wild, sort of unrestrained egalitarianism. And there's sort of like this line that one can draw from, say, Thomas More backwards, right? Via, well, like from Thomas More, I can't remember if it was Thomas Aquinas, or maybe it was Roger Bacon. I think it was Roger Bacon. Sort of Thomas More, Roger Bacon, down to Plato, and how sort of funny how Tristan mentions Pythagoras, because there's a sort of genesis. And if you think about, and in some ways there's a genuine reason to say this, but in what we would consider the sort of the Academy of Athens, and this sort of this Platonic school, and this prominence that Greek thinkers placed upon sort of raw rationality. In the end, what is it that we are confronted with? It's sort of like this global corporate technocracy is kind of like turbocharged rationalism without any other consideration to fulfill their ends, of course. But in some ways, maybe I could be wrong here, but I'm just sort of speculating on the idea that perhaps what we saw with this genesis with Pythagoras and Plato is this sort of hyper rationalism, this sort of hyper sort of tangible sort of rationalism, that all else must be subject to this line of thinking. And what we actually have is a far, far more distant route. Not that this stream's about that, but I'm just sort of speculating, because we touched on it, that there's actually even a more distant origin point than the Seventh-day Adventists, as we were talking about just prior to going live.
I like that take. I mean, I think that the hyper rationalism, and it's not saying that like, oh, well, if you don't believe in hyper rationalism, you throw away all reason and you're just, pure gobbledygook mystic, all just about my experience, bro. But like, when you look at the first 1,000 years of church history, I think it's really important to look at the church fathers and how they viewed the world was not hyper rationalistic, but actually in many ways baptized human reason. And there's a certain point in the analysis of reality and our experience of reality where you do come up against the mystery, and allowing the mystery to be the mystery was really important in the early church fathers. So I think this is something that I think is so beautiful, complete, and redemptive about the Eastern church fathers. As we read like St. John of Damascus, when you read St. Gregory Palamas, and the idea of the essence energies distinction, this did become a breaking point between what became the West and what's now considered the East, right? So I think that's a great point. I know this stream's not about that. I don't want to go too deep into it. I'm not an expert on this at all, but this is a great point that you make there.
Yeah, I was just going to mention, some years ago, quite a few years ago now, I read a book by Arthur Herman called The Cave and the Light: Plato versus Aristotle and the Struggle for the Soul of Western Civilization. Okay. And his argument in that book is that there has always been these two different ways of looking at the world. These two kind of the Platonic approach and the Aristotelian approach, and they've been kind of allowed to breathe, or they've one or the other has become prominent at different times. And I seem to remember in there that Aristotle was very insistent that the world basically was made for men, that only men have a soul. Animals don't have a soul, for example. And he's very like how can I put this? Like he's he doesn't go by pure like by reason alone. He takes a kind of more empirical approach to things, we might say. And then the thing that Herman does in that book is that he then draws links between, like, so he says, well, clearly you can draw a line between like Aristotle and Aquinas, for example, whereas certain other people, like these more revolutionary types, have a more Platonic. I mean, it's warped. It's not like pure like Platonic thinking, but it's like a kind of warped Platonism can be seen in, Jacobins and various other revolutionary forces in history, because they're always trying to, they're tending towards these systems of pure reason, if you want.
And they end up going to a very unreasonable place, right? They end up becoming mystics by turning reason. They basically kind of like deify reason in many ways. That makes sense.
Yeah. Now, I am not saying that Plato himself was a leftist in any sense. But you can have. What I'm saying is that a Platonic way of reasoning can lead to becoming like unmoored in this kind of world of just theory, if you want, and then trying to impose that vision on the world. Like, for example, you mentioned Francis Bacon, Furious, right? Francis Bacon wrote a book called New Atlantis, where he basically envisages a society run by technocratic scientists. This kind of trend towards utopianism, whereas when Thomas More, who's obviously in the kind of more in the Aristotle Aquinas way of looking at the world, when he writes utopia, he's deeply skeptical of it, and does everything he can to draw a distance between the utopian vision and himself, to the point where his protagonist in Utopia is literally a man whose name is a synonym. I can't remember. It's like his name is Raphael Hathliday, which is like a synonym for nonsense. So it's just like, there's a marked contrast between the way that Bacon and More, just in that period, looked at utopian visions. One deeply skeptical, the other much more taken with the idea of that you could achieve this kind of perfect society. And anyway, shall we move forward?
Yes, I think that's a good idea.
So
I think a good starting point, AA, if I may, would be, now that Tristan's, we know we got him on board and all of his devices work, thank goodness. We should try and maybe establish a starting point with Seventh-day Adventism, Kellogg's brothers, and leading into the 1900s. I think because of the Industrial Revolution and the sanitarium thing is a good lead point to the modern manifestation of the anti-meat movement. What do you guys think? Is that a good starting point from here?
Yeah. Why don't we talk about? I mean, everybody knows about Kellogg's and his cornflakes, so why don't we start with that?
Exactly, because you have actually done a stream sort of pertaining to the Kellogg's brothers, haven't you?
Me?
Yes, or not?
I don't think so. No.
Okay.
No.
So, John, correct me if I'm mistaken, Tristan, but you have the main sort of scientific of the two brothers, which is John Harvey Kellogg, sort of attempts to essentially devise this very plain sort of food. And I actually can't remember what his initial starting point was. I don't think it was fiber, because I don't think they quite understood the function of fiber back then. But there was there was a reason for the development of the original Kellogg's cornflakes, and the original product was very flavorless, quite in a texture context, quite unpalatable, and not very good. And it's actually his brother, sort of, you might say that John Harvey Kellogg was kind of like although somewhat deranged scientist, but sort of at least superficially honest in what he wanted to achieve, was by making this garbage product that made people's life hell. His brother comes along, the typical sort of merchant class style, and thinking, oh, how can I profit from this? And then basically ladens this product with sugar, makes it palatable, makes it tasty, and they eventually create like this sort of toasting process by which to sort of create what we now understand as a cornflake. And then
they came up with the idea of flaking. I think they figured out how can you flake corn, and I think they did it with wheat or rye as well. And if I'm not, someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the industrial process came first, and then the utopian idea of turning man into a beautiful, happy, healthy soy boy maybe came after the industrial process was discovered.
So
I think that's right.
Yeah. What is the connection then between? Because on the face of it, it's like, well, what's wrong with we've all had cornflakes? What's wrong with that?
Well, I think if you want to understand how healthy human populations eat, one of the best works that I would point people to is Dr. Weston A. Price's Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, which was published in 1939. And that book is one of the best, one of the most important, in my opinion, like sociological and nutrition science books of the 20th century, because he, at the cusp of the Second World War, visited healthy populations that weren't experiencing the ravages of what he called the diseases of civilization, which were tuberculosis, cancer, and dental caries, especially in America as well as in the UK. People were notoriously having terrible dental health, children getting their teeth rotting out, people missing teeth, and the palate not developing properly as far as the width of the human jaw, and then also narrowness in the hips is another thing that he noticed was not present in populations that were eating what he called I don't know if he used the word ancestral, because this word has been really turned into something just so obnoxious now by everybody's favorite Instagram guru, Liver King. I mean, this guy's ruined so many words that are associated with Weston A. Price's work, unfortunately. But he traveled to the Hebrides Islands. He traveled to the Lochental Valley in Switzerland. He traveled among some Peruvian populations, American Indian populations who were living off of like manatees. And what he found was that all of these cultures had certain.
Sorry to interrupt. How on earth do you eat a manatee? That's ridiculous.
It's called a sea cow. I've always been curious as well.
I'm just curious, like, how would you
how do you hunt the man? Well, they're very calm, so I don't know how they went about doing this, but that's one of my favorite sections of the book, because I'm really curious on what manatee fat tastes like. I bet it's really good. They look real fat.
You make manatee crackling. I'm not joking. Carry on. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but when you think back then, there wasn't, use of hydrocarbon fuels, and so you're not gonna have diesel contamination in the ocean. So it probably was a pretty good food before there was, big pollution. So, anyways, he found that they all had certain similarities. They all had some plant foods in the diet, except a few groups like the Inuit, who ate an all animal food diet. But he found that they all put special reverence to fatty animal foods for fertility, for vitality and growth, and for health. And he was looking at cultures where there would often be, he would look at a family, and very often there'd be one brother who works at the post office, and the brother that works at the post office is eating imported foods. He's eating jams, he's eating processed, he's eating refined flour. And he would find that the health and development of that sibling would be very different from the sibling that was eating the ancestral diet. And by ancestral diet, we don't have to like do this game of like, oh, like what did this imaginary caveman that we're going to invent in our mind eat? Like you don't have to do this, gay paleo diet nonsense. You can just look at cultures like Weston Price did that were healthy, and they were focusing on animal foods, especially fatty animal foods. And they would eat some carbohydrates, the ones that had them available. but they all venerated and revered and knew the high importance of animal foods. West and Price ended up postulating that there were certain factors in these animal fats, which later were discovered to be vitamin D, vitamin A, vitamin K2. He found that these compounds were very important for growth. In fact, in one of the chapters, he knew about vitamin A, but he didn't know about vitamin K2. It hadn't been isolated and discovered yet. But in one of the chapters, he talks about livestock and how farmers know that if you deprive pigs of vitamin A, their offspring will be born retarded in growth, and their central nervous systems won't be properly formed, and they will be born blind. And then in extreme cases of extreme vitamin A deprivation, and that's the retinol form of vitamin A, the fat soluble form, they will be born without eyes. So people who keep livestock understand that there are certain vitamins and minerals that these animals need in order to grow, in order to develop. Weston did a great job.
Just about what you're saying, Tristan, as well, because I remember watching this a little while ago, because I think it was just maybe a couple of months before you first came on to AA's channel, and you did like a watch along of is it Pottinger's cat experiment? Is that correct? Yeah, and in the end, we're talking about cats. I mean, cats, although we are both mammals, are very different species, sort of physiologically, digestively to humans. I mean, whatever. But just for anyone who wants to be shocked as to the generational degradation that can occur as a result of bad diets, I do recommend anyone to watch Tristan's video, which he sort of does a watch along on Pottinger's cat experiment from the 70s, if I'm not mistaken, like mid-late 70s. And basically by the third generation, because I think there were three groups. Basically, those cats fed a raw diet, which, I mean, cats need to because of the sort of feline, sort of canine sort of groups of animals. Cats are most sensitive to taurine, which taurine you get from raw meat. And the raw meat cats basically went from generation to generation with no observable difference in physical performance in terms of structure, physiognomy. As each generation came along, there was no visible degradation. The ones who were on cooked meat had some degeneration, but it was very gradual. It wasn't by so like the fourth and fifth generation where there was sort of pronounced observable differences in this degeneration along a long time. And then the third group were basically fed, I suppose, what you call like a kibble diet, more or less. And by the third generation, cats were rendered infertile. When they were, I mean, I'm saying this to sort of like obviously promote, being mean to animals, but as a part of the test, I'd actually sort of kind of throw these cats a few meters in the air and see if they'd land on their feet. And the ones fed the raw meat diet, would land on their paws and there'd be no ill effects and their bodies wouldn't be harmed. A number of cats, when they threw them that were on the worst diet for them, would suffer spinal fracture. They'd fracture their limbs. They wouldn't land on their feet. So basically, this is showing like degradation of neurology. This is showing degradation of bone density, and the cats would have a shorter lifespan. They would, and in fact, by the third generation, I think I might just mention it, but we're literally struggling to procreate from the third generation onwards because they were basically rendered infertile.
Exactly. Yeah. So nutrient deficiencies lead to social changes, physiological changes, and fertility changes.
I just thought I'd mention, by the way, that some mad lad in Florida has been making manatee steaks. I don't know if there's a lot of manatees in Florida, and so it looks like salmon, but actually this is a manatee steak. This is like manatee, like I don't know what part of the man. I guess that's the tail, right?
You don't think he's just messing with you? That looks like tuna.
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I can find the other manatee steaks if you want.
I believe that someone's eating those manatee steaks, especially in Florida. He probably eats gator too, right?
Yeah, I'm having a look, and they always look like that. Oh my gosh! Yeah, there's lots of pictures of manatee steaks.
All right, can we bring him on and he just do like I want to know everything about this. How much fat's on that manatee? Does it have suet? Does it have a liver?
I'm guessing. I mean, here's a different picture from these mad people from Florida who eat manatees on the regular. It seems like this is from the tail and this is from like the back, I guess, of the manatee. I think. I'm guessing like you can't really have like manatee belly because it's all like blubber, I'd imagine. So,
Is this legal? Are we gonna get someone in trouble by even talking about this?
well, I mean, I'm not sure.
Susan, we are not endorsing the consumption of manatees. We're merely demonstrating that it occurs.
I mean, I'm not sharing where this is from. I'm just saying that if you,
I'm not saying
type
you
in-
should do this, but if you do this, share some with me, please.
So there we go. All right.
Yeah.
Carry on, guys.
So,
Well, going back to Kellogg, actually, it'd be worth mentioning that initially the product wasn't all that popular, and it was when his brother came along and sort of had this sort of light bulb idea to throw sugar at it and to sort of toast it and caramelize the surface. And for anyone who knows the science of cooking, it's called the Maillard effect. It sort of makes food more palatable. But that's like the crust on your steak, for instance. That's the Maillard effect. Is when sugars are caramelized into sort of that nice brown crust on food. And so they toasted with sort of like sugar, more or less, to create the cornflake, and then the cornflake became, because up until one might say World War One, or and possibly even up to World War Two, most breakfasts that people had were, I mean, even if there was like a bit of bread involved, it was things like beans or things like eggs and bacon and speck and very nourishing, filling foods that had how can I put this, proper nutritional nourishment from major food groups that weren't synthetic foods, right? And like I said, it doesn't matter if there was a couple of slices of bread, but it was with like some nice homegrown beans and some fresh eggs and whatever, and a breakfast would be substantive. And Tristan, I'm sure will agree with me here, but the whole idea that they have managed to implant literally in our psyche that there is such a thing as a breakfast cereal is nonsense, when it was nothing more than an early 19th century, mid 20th century contrivance. I mean, breakfast cereals became ubiquitous as a breakfast food in inverted commas through the sheer power of marketing campaigns and nutritional guidelines. That is basically how breakfast cereals became a thing. I mean, at most,
it was all marketing.
Yeah, exactly.
You're right. I mean, refined sugar was introduced and started being used by more people around 1822. So this is a newer concept, right? Like, people didn't have a lot of refined sugar until around 1822. 1866, cottonseed oil was first introduced in the U.S., and that's the first time it was ever eaten by humans, and it wasn't adapted en masse. It was mostly used as lubrication in industrial machinery, right? They ran out of whale oil, started using the cottonseed oil, right? The roller mill technology that started refining wheat flour, that's 1880 that got rolled out. So we didn't have refined wheat flour until, less than 142 years ago. 1911 is when Procter & Gamble introduced the Crisco product, which is trans fat. It's like cottonseed oil made so it's solid at room temperature to try to imitate butter. So it was a new phenomenon, and you didn't have heart disease before this. There wasn't even like a word for ischemic heart disease, right? You didn't have the cancer rates you have now. You didn't have diabetes being so rampant. You had very low levels of obesity in the entire world. So the seed oils really got introduced to us en masse in around like 1911. And the Kellogg connection to all this, the introduction of the breakfast cereal and the marketing of this, the same marketing was also used for Crisco. And this marketing has to do with liberation, right? It's all this, it's going to liberate the woman from the dregs of having to deal with these nasty animals. Oh, those animals, they're so dirty. Animals are it's so hard to deal with. You can move to the city. You can eat Crisco instead. You can eat cornflakes, right? And then also, Kellogg had these ideas of temperance that he would take to an extreme. And it was kind of this, it's almost a Gnostic idea that procreation is bad. Human sexuality is inherently bad. Meat makes you uber virile and will inflame your lower animal nature. These again, it's like this revolutionary thing of we're going to liberate the woman, right? You're going to get the right to vote. We're going to give you, you're going to drive cars. You're going to vote. You're going to smoke cigarettes. You're going to smoke your freedom cigarettes. You're going to be liberated from the shackles of your former life if you just embrace hyper industrialization, which then, of course, leads to more consolidation, because the Industrial Revolution, let's be honest, this requires a lot of consolidation of resources and power at the hands of corporation or the state, whichever one's going to be driving it. And then, eventually they kind of always end up becoming one entity. So yeah, the revolutionary thing of like liberation was a major marketing component of this.
So sorry to bring it back to the manatees, folks, but I did find that it does seem to be legal. There is the manateemeatcompany.com in Crystal River in Florida, where you can get different, like you can have flipper, brisket, flank. So if you're in Florida, like if I have any viewers in Florida, please track down the manatee. I'd love to somebody to sample some manatee just to let me know what it's like.
That's amazing. Well, and also when you read that chapter in Weston Price's book, and you look at the population of manatees has decreased a lot over the last years, especially with commercial fishing and ships and stuff like that. But man, I mean, there was an abundance of animal foods available for this. I think they were called the Seminole people of Florida, and they were basically living off of manatee. They ate very little plant food. They had some fruits available, but they wouldn't eat just like a fruit-based diet. Same with the Plains Indians, right? The Cherokee, the Plains Indians would live off of buffalo, and they would herd the buffalo throughout the Plains regions. And I mean, these are people who were hyper consumers of animal foods and would consume plant foods in small amounts, and they'd grow large. They would have great health if they made it through the first few years of life. And if they made it through childbirth, they would live long, healthy lives. And also, they didn't have a lot of the social problems that come with industrialization, right? Mental illness, right? I mean, you even look at the medieval world. You don't see levels of mental illness. You don't see the levels of societal discord, and that a lot of these come with modernization. And Weston A. Price noticed this, but the physical aspect does affect the behavioral aspect, the social and emotional and spiritual aspect.
In the interest of balance, I'm just going to play devil's advocate a second. I'm not disagreeing with you guys. I just want to hear what you'd say, basically, if I push back on a few of these things. First of all, the oils that you mentioned, okay, the dreaded seed oils. You said that the push towards these started in the late 19th century, but I mean, Furious, you mentioned Italy. Is it not the case that olive oil goes back like hundreds and thousands of years?
Olives are a fruit.
So olive oil doesn't count as a seed oil. Is that what you're saying?
Well,
yeah, it's a monounsaturated fat, which are fine. Now, the olive oil, you can't fully replace animal foods with olive oil because of the lack of like vitamin K2, vitamin A, vitamin D, some of these fat-soluble vitamins you find in animals. But the cultures that are eating olive oil also eat lamb, suet, right? You look at the Greek populations, which Ansel Keys, in developing the dietary guidelines, or the seven
admitted it.
he went to Crete, right? Was it Crete that he went to? And he was
it was an island. I can't remember which one.
He went to one of these islands, and he was like, "Look, it's this vegetarian utopia. They don't eat meat and they're healthy." But he went during Great Lent. He went during Lent when nobody's eating animal foods, and that's what the study is based.
So what are the big no seed oils, just for people at home? Like when you guys say seed oils, what exactly do you have in mind?
So there's like soybean, corn, canola, cottonseed, rapeseed, grapeseed, sunflower, safflower, rice bran oil. These are sometimes called vegetable oils, right? So we're not talking about olive oil. Coconut oil is a saturated fat, right? It's very healthy saturated fat. What we're talking about is the newer inventions that require heavy industrial processing, and like they have to go through these basically
hydrolyzation, bleaching, heating, extracting. Yeah, no, sorry, Tris, I'm just sort of buttressing. Yeah, exactly. Like this very heavily mechanized process to sort of almost create something out of nothing. Sorry, continue, Tristan. Didn't mean to butt in.
Oh no, for sure. I mean, I totally agree. Yeah, that's all I got to say about that. Yeah, so the soybean, the corn, canola, cottonseed, rapeseed, grapeseed, sunflower, safflower, rice bran. These are all the ones to avoid, and they're all very high in what's called polyunsaturated fats, right?
Mhm.
PUFA, another word for these. Sometimes they call them plant oils, omega-6 oil. Oh, it's so good. It's omega-6 linoleic acid oil. These are the
Mhm.
ones to avoid, and the
But
reason.
if I wanted to deep fry a chip, right? What would I use instead? Or because olive oil can't get that hot, so I can't. You can't deep fry chips in olive oil. I'm just trying to think of some uses that I would use. Like,
Well,
when would I pull out rapeseed or sunflower oil? It would only
well,
really be for for deep frying. So what would you use instead?
Well, for instance, if you take into account that there was an awful lot of pressure brought upon the McDonald's corporation up until the 80s, because I think it was, oh, correct me if I'm wrong, Tristan, I think it was 87. I think McDonald's made the shift, or like 92. It was around from the like 80s to 90s, right? McDonald's cooked everything in beef tallow. And then sort of the screws got put on. The screws got put on by the American Heart Foundation, et cetera, and they then converted to seed oils, right? And you can deep fry things in tallow or suet. You just have to change the oil just a little bit more frequently. I mean, in the end, McDonald's ran a very successful global corporation up until the 90s by cooking their foods in beef tallow. I'm not saying that McDonald's was ever a bastion of healthy food, but at the very least, beef fat is something that is not going to harm us. Now, there's a slight question to be said for, okay, if you have high fats in concentration with carbohydrates, yeah, sure, there's an obesity, food consumption, calorie question there. But in terms of the oil itself being bad for us, that is an emphatic no. It is, and Tristan's got a few graphs here, and I hope we can sort of dig into this a little bit more. But there's the massive transition from, you might say, oils that humans are evolutionarily adapted to and have had in their diets for thousands of years, and that we can ingest and we can process and that we can absorb by and large and actually have health benefits to. And this is sort of a part of where I might, as you say, about this, because the food pyramid is arguably one of the greatest psyops that has been inflicted upon Western people in the last 50 years. We sort of see fat as, oh, fat bad, fat bad, fat bad. But actually, if you look at our human physiology, and I mean, Tristan could buttress this if he wants to, with muscle formation, there are amino acids that exist fat soluble vitamins that exist in animal fats that we actually require. Our brain matter. A large portion of the white matter of our brain is actually composed of fats. Now, like Tristan said, that if you look at this the price study on these sort of less developed cultures, Alzheimer's disease essentially is a non-existent phenomenon. There's no such thing as dementia, because the brain is such a fragile organ in our body that requires a certain systematic sort of balance of nourishment, that with the demonization of fats, we simply have not taken in enough dietary fats, and the dietary fats that we have taken in recent decades we can't absorb them, we can't use them, and so hence the massive and just as a caveat, I must say, as an asterisk, I'm not speaking about the people with a genetic disposition to dementia and Alzheimer's. That's different. But that as an aside, for people who ordinarily would not get these things, what we basically have is diabetes of the brain, which is more or less what dementia and Alzheimer's disease are.
The other thing I wanted to just mention very quickly on the mental health front is that if I were to, confront somebody with their modern copy of the DSM and so on and so forth with what you guys said, I can very much imagine them saying, well, you imagine that about the medieval era or about eras of past. It was just undiagnosed. There was probably a lot of people with ADHD and autism and diabetes and so on in, I don't know, 1381. They just didn't know about them. How did you guys come back on that?
I mean, there's obviously going to be genetic anomalies of every everything that is living on this earth has some kind of genetic structure to it, and there's always anomalies to genetics. Like, obviously, there anomalies occur, right? It's just part and parcel of being an organism. But I mean, the thing is, again, one of the best demonstrations is that, and I know this is going to sound semi-anecdotal, but take a photo of a beach in Australia or a beach in California or Miami
and look at photos from the 50s and 60s and 70s. You literally need a microscope to find someone who's overweight, never mind obese. Take a similar photo today of society, and rather than like the fat person being in this distinct minority, you're confronted with a larger proportion of people who are either overweight or in fact in the obese category. And that's just a reflection alone of how chronic disease has become endemic as a result of diet and lifestyle.
Yeah, I'm not trying to. I'm honestly not trying to be a dick here.
No. I know.
They would say.
I'm just giving a stern.
They would say.
They
would say though. Hold on a second. Those people in the 1950s or the 1960s have already had. You know, I mean, they were eating Kellogg's cornflakes in the 1950s and the 1960s. They were eating seed oils. They were eating so. That's like what we need is data from 1381 to show that the medieval man or the people who didn't have these sorts of diets, didn't have these sorts of conditions. 1950s, 1960s can't. Like, why should that count? Because it's part of the it's part of the era where people were becoming
I've just popped a link, an image link in Streamlabs in the chat here if you just want to pull it up. Because ultimately it's a question of proportion too. Some of these things were occurring in the 50s and 60s, but what you see by this graph that I've shown here is if you talk about percentages and sheer volume, you got to think from 1950 to 2010, you have a 5.5-fold increase in consumption of vegetable oils that accelerates over time. I mean, that would obviously play into the thing that you're describing about, this was happening then but not now. But it's a question of proportion of scale of mass consumption. It's obviously here. The data exists here as to how the fractions play out from. I mean, you got to think this timescale starts in 1909. I mean, you've got 100 years of data. It's there.
For me, that pretty conclusively answers that question. To me, But.
And I don't. If you see the last link I just dropped in there, if you wouldn't mind pulling that one up, I think you'll like this one as well. This is heart disease deaths versus saturated fat or vegetable oil consumption. Right. So now, prior to 1900, there were no recorded cases of heart disease. Right. Like this wasn't on the map. The first known case of death from heart disease was recorded in 1912. And if you look at the amount of saturated fat consumed per capita, hasn't much changed, but the vegetable oil consumption does seem to trace very closely with the heart disease deaths. And I'm sure if you were to, that vegetable oil consumption graph is also going to trace directly with processed food consumption graph. And by processed food, it's basically refined flour, white sugar, and vegetable oils. That's what most of the processed foods are made of. So I think this data piece right here of heart disease skyrocketing with vegetable oil consumption.
Can I ask a quick question here? I mean, this data does look pretty convincing to me, just on the face of it, having never seen these things before. One of the things I remember reading about some years ago was corn syrup. Okay. Corn syrup seems to be very prevalent in America, in American foods. And in this country, we have, for some reason, they don't use as much corn syrup and stuff. And you can actually taste the difference. Like if I go to America, I can taste the amount of corn syrup and stuff. It's just got a different texture and flavor to it. They put it in everything. They even put it in like can of Coke, bloody crisps.
It's in milk.
It's in everything.
It's dairy products. Yeah.
Now, does corn syrup count as a vegetable oil, or is that a separate thing?
Well, it's not an oil. Corn syrup. So when you look at corn syrup, the only real difference between corn syrup and like white sugar is there's about 5% more fructose in corn syrup. In my opinion, the data about corn syrup is you can be interpreted either way. I think it's hard to make a definitive statement on corn syrup's bad, it's causing all this obesity. I think there is an argument to be made that's makes a lot of sense and is valid and seems to line up with the data that corn syrup does tend to increase fatty liver, right? When you have an excess of fructose, your liver absorbs fructose very effectively. So when you have a dearth of fructose, the liver tends to begin to eventually start to accumulate fat. And fatty liver, I think it can be argued that fatty liver can be exacerbated by corn syrup, but the argument for the avoidance of seed oils is much more straightforward because we understand, we know the data, right? The science. there is and I'm gonna send you an image right now. I think you'll really like this one. AA. This last image I showed you, if you could just pull that up, this gives a great breakdown. And again, shout out to Dr. Chris Knobe, Knobbe. This slide and a couple of slides that I showed come from him, from his low carb down under speech on the diseases of civilization. Now, omega-6 fatty acids, which is the seed oils, right, in excess, which we just showed the graph showing the increase in these seed oils, tracing with heart disease, right? You can also graph obesity, and you're going to see it directly correlates, and then cancer rates as well. Now, I'm not saying all cancer. I think there's other aspects that are affecting cancer, including toxicity. There are cancer clusters clearly around wireless radiation towers. There, microwave radiation affects our cells as well, and affects reactive oxygen species. But this graph right here shows how many of the diseases of modern civilization, or whatever you want to call it, the diseases of modernity, the diseases of civilization, or what Dr. Weston A. Price called them. So what you have is reactive oxygen species, which is essentially very oxidized omega-6 fatty acids that store in our adipose tissues, right? This is creating what's called catastrophic lipid peroxidation cascades. So essentially, this is a hyperinflammatory response, right? Which then is going to contribute to all these peroxides being released in the body, pathogens and mitochondrial dysfunction resulting from that pathogen exposure, right? Because the mitochondria they call them the powerhouses of the cell. The mitochondria are in the cell, and that is what creates ATP. That is what generates cellular energy and electricity. And there's a magnetic field along with the electrical current. So magnetism and electricity are created through the mitochondria. And you have a direct a causal link between omega-6 fatty acids in excess that will store in our cells, which our cells are not used to being inundated with so much of these fats. In the past, now they've done, there have been studies on linoleic acid, which is the omega-6 fatty acids in adipose tissue, which I'll drop another image here. If you don't mind pulling this one up. Mm-hmm. Linoleic acid in adipose tissue. In 1959, it was about 9.1%, right? And that's already higher than what you see in certain populations that are like the, not the Kitavans. What was that population? I wrote it down. Anyway, you see in healthy populations that are eating their kind of native diet, you're looking at about 2 to 3% linoleic acid in the adipose tissue, in the fat tissues. 1959, on average, 9.1% linoleic acid in adipose tissue. By 2008, we have an average of 21.5% linoleic acid in adipose tissue. That is a massive increase in this type of fat that is causing, now if you pull up the other image, the omega-6 in excess in westernized diet, this one shows that what this causes is mitochondrial dysfunction, which can cause heart failure, obesity, cancer through mitochondrial DNA mutation, Alzheimer's through cell apoptosis and necrosis and neurodegeneration, and then also metabolic syndrome, which results in type 2 diabetes, the inability for the body to efficiently use the hormone insulin to shuttle glucose into the cells, right? Insulin resistance, and then this leads to obesity. So you do have mechanisms that can show a direct causal link between omega-6 in excess and all of these diseases that are plaguing our culture. Now, I think excess sugar, excess grain consumption, which results in lower levels of certain nutrients in the diet that Weston A. Price so effectively demonstrated in his work. Those also come into play, but you can see that increase in omega-6 fatty acids in our diet and thus in our adipose stores is affecting how the body functions, and the body is not used to this or designed for it.
Just very quickly, just because you mentioned how the body functions, Tristan, I just want to emphasize at the cellular level, as in, if you consider the fact that cholesterol acts as a vehicle within the body, right, to bring nutrients to and from cells, right, and through the bloodstream, that seed oils disrupt this process at the cellular level of our being. Like you don't get more fundamental than that. I mean, here you've got it here, that nuclear and mitochondrial DNA mutations. You know, you can't get any more sort of small scale than that in the human body. Sorry, go away.
So, well, I've got two questions here. One, I mean, no offense to any Americans listening or watching, or to Tristan or anyone else, but I mean, I've been to quite a few different parts of America, and one of the things that I can't help but notice when I go there, whether it's East Coast, West Coast, South, Florida, you name it, I have seen these people there, is that, yes, we have obesity here in the UK. We've got like fat people everywhere, you know, even I am probably, you know, on the chunky side and so on and so forth. But when I've been to America, it is at a scale and at a, like, you see people in America who are like literally in wheelchairs because they're that fat, or like, you know, like literally like a, I mean, I always mention like the 20, 30 stone black woman, but like, you know, I see people just who are off the scale. Now, is there a dietary factor to that, or is that just a kind of impulse thing? Like, why? I mean, you do see fat people in Britain, but not on that level. Do you guys have an idea of what accounts for those? Like, I don't know what you call them, like super obese or like morbidly obese or whatever you call. Like, it's when it reaches that scale where there's like a woman who's walking down the aisle and literally her ass takes the entire aisle, and it's like, whoa, like woohoo, like how do these people even like walk? And some of them can't. What accounts for that in America, first of all?
I'll start just because it's fresh in the memory. Just because sorry, I just wanted to take off to grab a coffee just for a moment. But when I left, you guys were talking about the high fructose corn syrup, and what has to be sort of taken into account here is that sort of these things that we're discussing here, like you know, meat-free veganism and seed oils and food pyramid and whatever. There's a lot of sort of cross-pollination between these ideas and these phenomena, and on the subject of high fructose corn syrup, think about the kind of foods that these are delivered with, because one thing that we have to sort of take into consideration here is the idea of lipogenesis, which is basically the creation of fat, right? You know, adipose tissue, lipo is fat, and basically to conceptualize this for the audience, the most the food which would create the most adipose tissue in your body is a donut, right? Because you have a deep fried, basically carbohydrate bomb laden with fat. And ultimately, so whatever food you intake in varying degrees, like even if you have like a steak, a salmon steak, or a T-bone or an egg, like you're going to get some kind of an insulin response because all food does that. But what insulin is insulin functions as a how it functions in the body is that when you take in calories, more or less, it delivers energy into the cell. Like insulin basically pries the cell open, and you know, energy passes through, and the cell utilizes that energy. But of course, when you consume beyond your requirements, then you store fat as adipose tissue, as body fat. And so insulin is a fat storage hormone. And the thing is, when you stimulate insulin in the body, you also stimulate a hormone called ghrelin. Ghrelin is a hunger hormone. And when you're taking in fat, which has a high calorific value, along with carbohydrates, which is a insulin stimulating nutrient, these things work hand in hand. And if you look at the American diet, you have a very high carbohydrate diet in concert with a high fat diet, and those fats are unhealthy fats, as Tristan and I have outlined in this stream so far. And you sort of have this, how would you describe it? Sort of like a double negative of the worst of both circumstances occurring at once. And you think of foods. Pizza's one, high oil content, high carbohydrate. A donut, higher fat, high carbohydrate. Even take like a particularly rich pasta dish. You have all the carbohydrates and you have fats. And when you're taking in these foods together, which is why, for instance, I've seen a few people say in the chat, the Mediterranean diet is the best diet. I'm not one to say that this diet's best or the other one's best, but if you look at the way Mediterranean people tend to eat, they will tend to isolate their carbohydrates from their fats with a little bit more diligence, shall I say. Or that, if you go to Italy and you order a pasta somewhere at a restaurant, it's, they use olive oil and it's not swimming in it. It's a light coating, or if you get a meat dish, it's not, with like a pound of potatoes. It's quite a different way of eating. And this American system, and I'm not trying to shit on the American audience because there's a lot of Americans we all like here on the stream today, and we actually have one with us with Tristan. But this mass marketing consumption culture that has come out of America, and we talk about the GAE in or the Empire of Lies, as you've started to use, right, as lexicon.
Yeah.
One thing they've absolutely mastered is this sort of almost psychop level of marketing and being able to pass messages onto the people, and this ability to sort of sell cheaper quantity, money, value for money kind of thing. Like, let's face it, the Happy Meal is an American concept. Like the 3 for 2 pizza deal is an American concept. Like, it's the genius of marketing, and being able to deliver this to the American, the American market, the American people, has been a masterstroke for them. If I may offer one anecdotal example, right? I had family of mine travel to America 10 years ago or so, and I mean I'm Italian, as you guys know, right? And the women in my family aren't particularly tall. They're very, they're sort of petite. And they went to a Dunkin' Donuts, and my aunt literally couldn't get a small drink. Like, the smaller size was like medium, and it was like medium in America is like 8 ounces. In Australia, it'd be half that size. So there you go.
Yeah, I'll never forget. I ordered can't remember where I was. I was in Orlando or one of these places once. And if I remember, they were doing some like basketball. There was a basketball player called Larry Bird who was on all of the.
He was a Boston Celtics player, wasn't he?
Yeah. He was on like all of the cups and all of the kind of. There was some like tie-in thing at the time, and I remember having ordering the meal, and the drink, which I mean I don't know if you've ever been to the UK, but like a large is a very specific standard size, and the large is the same size across the board. You go to Burger King, McDonald's, it's always the same. But that large was basically their small, and the one that came with the meal, I'm not kidding you now, it was a bucket. It was just like it was this massive. I couldn't believe it. I was just like, how am I meant to drink that? Like,
it feels like you've bought a vat, right? Like a small
vat. It was fucking insane. I was like, I could drink this for the next 3 hours and not get to the bottom of it. So, I mean, maybe the portion size is part of the answer to this. So now that I think about it, but I did have another question for the both of you.
If you don't mind, if I could just pipe in real quick, I'd say the difference between the American diet and much of the world, you guys nailed it with the normalization of fast food, this idea of this hyper consumption of quick, easy, revolutionary science kibble is basically like what people are eating. Like, look at the newest kibble that science can give you, the Beyond Burger, right? Well, but when you break it down to what are the components of these foods, it comes down to processed sugar, refined wheat flour, right? And these are nutrient deficient foods. When you make white sugar, you're removing all of the minerals that get taken up into the soil and put into that food, and you're reducing it to sucrose and fructose, right? When you eat the high fructose corn syrup, you're removing all the minerals and you're just taking out the high fructose and the sucrose from that from that food, right? I'm sorry, the fructose and glucose from the corn, right? So you're eating these really refined, low nutrient density foods, and these are displacing the high nutrient density animal foods and properly prepared plant foods that include grains in all of the healthy cultures that we inherited, and essentially gave up from our great grandparents' generation. So I think America is on the fast track of technocratic control over the food supply. And the foods they're eating are they're full of the omega-6 fatty acids. They're full of the vegetable oils, the seed oils, right? Those seed oils lead to mitochondrial dysfunction, which leads to insulin resistance and obesity, right? And they're full of sugar, right? Which, when you have a high insulin load combined with insulin resistance, combined with a high polyunsaturated fat intake, you're storing tons of fat, as Furious so eloquently said. And so it's high carb, and it's high in the wrong type of fat. But carbs are not inherently bad. Fat is not inherently bad. We have to look at this from a nuanced standpoint. Healthy populations have always consumed fats. They've always consumed carbohydrates. There are healthy populations who consume like 90% of their diet from carbohydrates, right? There are cultures in Papua New Guinea that are eating like 90% starches, right? Now, from the carbs equal bad, fat equals good standpoint, which I think is wrong, right? I don't think carbs are bad. I don't think fat is bad. From that standpoint, it gets completely destroyed by these healthy populations of like Katavans, who are eating basically a sweet potato diet with pork feasts, not all the time, but regularly, right? So saturate.
I do have to say, I mean, over the weekend I mentioned I took AAA. I also made a just a classic kind of beef stew, beef, onions, carrots, bit of wine in there. I used olive oil, Furious, not any other sort of oil. But
I'm glad to hear, sir.
Yeah, but it does make you can taste and feel the difference when you eat something that's quote unquote homemade in that way, which has no processed elements whatsoever. It's all just natural ingredients.
Hey, I'm curious. When you get fish and chips in the UK, what are they frying that in?
It really depends, but I'm guessing these days it would be mostly in sunflower oil, if I had to guess, or rapeseed oil. It did used to be the case that it was done in beef fat, I believe, or lard, like the back in the day. But I think a lot of them would have changed over now to.
But England being England, I'm sure, or Britain actually, because obviously the Scots are quite famous for their fish and chips too. I reckon there'd be some of those holdout sort of family places on the high street where they've survived. I reckon.
Yeah,
I mean, I don't know. I'm just presuming, but
like a family-run
place.
But you've got to remember the supply chains for these things as well, though.
Exactly.
Where after a certain, like I remember, there's one of the chain places, for example, Harry Ramsden's. It has like a bit of history when you go to Harry Ramsden's about it. I wouldn't recommend going up there, by the way, because it's obviously like a chain. But it talks about how it used to be done, like in beef fat. But I very much doubt they still do it in beef fat, because you can taste the beef. And
as someone with a chefing background, and I know sometimes D and I jokingly sort of spar on this issue, but for those of us with a culinary background, which such Mr. D and myself actually have, as both former chefs, is that just if you fancy doing an experiment yourself, like if you just want to elucidate or experiment this in your own time, just to sort of enlighten yourself about this, and I don't obviously endorse people eating chips on the regular, but just for the sake of it, you want to, on a Sunday, cook some chips, have some fun, whatever, right? Buy a bag of chips from your local supermarket, right? Try and get your hands on some tallow, right? Beef tallow. And then buy some, don't only do this once and throw the rest down in the garbage.
When you say tallow, do you mean lard? Do you mean lard?
Yeah. Beef tallow is, lard's from pig, but it's the same thing, right? Like tallow is from beef specifically. But lard, tallow, pick your animal fat, right? And then on this one and only occasion, buy canola oil or sunflower oil or rice bran oil, whatever oil you want to do it in, and just cook 2 batches of chips, right? And then taste them and eat them, or even batter some fish and cook it yourself, right? You will taste the difference immediately. And I actually honestly would go so far to say, if you ate them on different occasions, your digestion would feel different as well. And
Yeah.
just test it for yourself, or even if you don't want to cook something, make a salad, make like a Mediterranean salad with a bit of feta cheese and some lettuce, or a bit of some olives and stuff, and just compare them. Although you don't use tallow for that, you'd use olive oil. But what I'm saying is, just do a comparison and try for yourself, and the proof is in the pudding. Pardon the pun.
Yeah. So the other question I wanted to ask about all of this was basically okay. So I can imagine a lot of people watching might say, well, yeah, I can see how all this stuff is bad, and this is a negative side effect, an unfortunate and negative side effect of modern living. It's just like, well, we have all of these mass industrial processes, and this is just an unfortunate side effect. But if I understand you guys correctly, you actually think that there's a conscious agenda behind this that has kind of pushed this. Would you like to outline that a little bit more?
Certainly, but just before that we do, because I know we haven't even touched the streams that I did link for you, but just as a start, just as a reference point, because Tristan did have that screenshot from that talk from that YouTube video. Can you go to the final, the fourth link of those videos, the Nina Teichholz's Real Food Politics video for me?
Yeah,
if you can. And we don't have to play it at all, but if you can take the timer, like the thing to the timestamp to like 2 minutes 40 seconds thereabouts, right?
2 minutes.
There we go. Yeah, 40
seconds.
something. Yeah. Okay. So after these guidelines were from the American Heart Foundation, courtesy of Ansel Keys, were passed, basically what if you were to watch this video, and I recommend people do, Nina Teichholz basically stipulates accurately that Americans were largely obedient of the measures that were passed down from the Heart Foundation in the 60s by Keys. And you can see here, right? So the graph starts in 1970, and this graph goes to 2014. The consumption of red meat diminishes 28%, beef broadly 35%, which is more aggressive than red meat because beef is a red meat. Pork is a decline of 10%, and veal, mutton, and lamb is down 75%. Although you can tell there's the bottom line, and it had a much lower basal rate, but it's 75% is a massive reduction, right? And then poultry and chicken go up 110 and 114% respectively. Now, if you just go, there should be another graph. If you go to like 3 minutes sort of 10, 3 minutes 05. Along AA, yeah. Consumption of vegetables up 20%, fresh fruits up 35%, grains up 28%, and vegetable oils up 87%. And then other things here. I mean, we already touched on the meats, but look, eggs down 13%, animal fats down 27%, butter down 9%. The American people followed these guidelines, which were established by elites almost to the letter. Right. Mm-hmm. And you got to think, for those of us who, I'm assuming you're interested in probably slightly older than I am. I'm in my early 30s. A lot of our viewers are from an age group from anywhere to like, I don't know, 40s to kids, Zoomers and stuff. Is for most of us who've been through the education system in the last 30 years, we've all been acquainted with the food pyramid, right? And it's got 6 to 12 serves of grains a day, and then fruits and vegetables, 3 and 6 or 2 and 5. Countries have had different policies, and then 2 serves or 1 to 2 serves of meat, and then oils in the occasional rare sort of top of the pyramid, right? And this framework has been established by we have thrown the word credentialism around quite a lot in recent times, and like the follow the science types. This came from those people. And the consequences of this has been a catastrophe, most pronounced in America. But Australia, actually, someone commented that Australia is a more overweight country in America. In terms of, we have high rates of obesity, but we have less aggressive rates in terms of we have more fat people per capita, but we're not as aggressively fat, if that makes sense. We have less like morbidly obese people. Yeah. But true. And I know in Britain you have a problem. I was in Italy, and I was in Italy and Central Europe in Germany in 2000, and Croatia and a few other places in 2019, just before COVID happened. And Europeans have less of a problem, but I noticed a lot more fat people than when I was there the time before, which was 10 years prior. And these people are doing their best to, my doctor says do this, and my school says to do that, and this is what the school lunches are. And look at the consequences, look at the results. And who pays the price for being wrong? Nobody.
I mean, one of the things I do remember being told quite a lot when I was growing up was that red meat makes you aggressive. That red meat is kind of like,
makes you virile and aggressive.
Yeah, I mean, is there any truth? Is there any truth? Because it was a pretty concerted push, enough for me to remember it when I was growing up.
Well,
it was kind of in the culture. Like people, like my mother would say it. Teachers would say it. If you eat too much red meat, you'll get aggressive, basically.
And most of these people tend to be women, by the way.
Yes, true.
It's the noggin jogging.
That was the hypothesis of Ellen G. White, right? It was, she basically channeled all of her information, right? She was this, essentially a New Age Protestant channeler who she had this kind of delusional vision that Jesus came to her and told her that she's so special, she's the new prophet, and she needs to write all these articles. She published like thousands of articles. I don't know if all of these were even written by her. Maybe she had, some ghostwriters or something, but she had a lot of material. And she said that red meat will make you virile and inflame the passions, right? Pythagoras as well said that red meat will make you aggressive and warlike. And if we can remove meat from the diet, and that was all meat for Pythagoras and most meat for Ellen G. White, who was also a hypocrite who ate a bunch of shellfish. But
I mean, it does, like, superficially though. It has, like, I know this sounds weird, but when Kellogg says, well, if you lived on nothing but cornflakes, your probably testosterone would go down. You might masturbate less, or
we know mechanisms for that too, because cholesterol is the building block of sex steroid hormones, right? So we're told to
all hormones, really, isn't? Well, most of them, right, Tristan?
Well, sex steroid hormones and vitamin D, which is a hormone.
Yeah.
The building block of this is cholesterol. And vitamin D, again, that's a hormone. Everybody looks at it as a vitamin, but it is actually a hormone that's involved in tons of physiological processes, and it's more than just the vitamin D that you get from the sun too.
I'm just saying intuitively, it feels right that a guy who would eat red meat would be more Chad, and a guy who, doesn't eat any red meat at all and just eats, I don't know, like lentils or whatever, is going to be more soy. It just has the feel of being right.
There's truth to the stereotypes, right? The stereotypes exist because they point to a certain truth, and even the leftists will admit this. As they stereotype white people as being aggressive meanies and stuff like this, right? But the leftists, they also agree that there are truths to the stereotypes. They come about for this reason. But we know that, like, cholesterol is a building block of sex steroid hormones. When you put somebody on statins, for instance, which are the most profitable drugs for pharmaceutical companies, well, at least before 2020. Now we all know that there's a new model which uses the same old model of this this hyper focus on a single metric, and all your health is based on this one metric, right? Use the PCR, and you can measure your health by whether you get this specific protein sequence. They did this with cholesterol, right? Cholesterol is bad, they tell you. It causes heart disease, and if you suppress cholesterol either through dietary means or through statins, what you notice across the board is there are several things that are measurable. One of those is that testosterone levels decrease. All right, testosterone levels decrease, and also social behavior becomes modified and even aberrant. But what's kind of paradoxical is when you look at statistics of prisoners who've committed violent crimes, right? Violent criminals statistically have low cholesterol, right? Low cholesterol is also associated with risk-seeking behavior and suicide and suicidal ideations and violence, right? Very, very fascinating. But low cholesterol does make you have less testosterone, but it's almost like there's this maybe a bell curve type situation. I don't know how to interpret this data, but like super low cholesterol leads to erratic and even violent behavior, almost like a cornered rat. you see that.
I dare say it's probably worth making the distinction, though, that that's not from necessarily like a testosterone-fueled aggression, but more like a derangement, sort of like a schizo kind of desperation response.
Starvation.
Not an aggressive response. I think that distinction should be made. Obviously, AA, just in the chat in Streamlabs here, I while we're on this subject, pull up that link I sent you, that image. It's it's kind of hilarious. It's an excerpt from an observer of the Mongol-Chinese wars, which is, I'll read it out if you want. I get a kick out of it every time I see this. Can I read it?
Yep.
The Chinese noted with surprise and disgust the ability of the Mongol warriors to survive on little food and water for long periods. According to one, the entire army could camp without a single puff of smoke since they needed no fires to cook. Compared to the Jurchen soldiers, the Mongols were much healthier and stronger. The Mongols consumed a steady diet of meat, milk, yogurt, and other dairy products, and they fought men who lived on gruel made from various grains. The grain diet of the peasant warriors stunted their bones, rotted their teeth, and left them weak and prone to disease. In contrast, the poorest Mongol soldier ate mostly protein, thereby giving him strong teeth and bones. Unlike the Jurchen soldiers, who were dependent on a heavy carbohydrate diet, the Mongols could more easily go a day or two without food. And who conquered who, by the way?
Yes, of course. Well, yes. So the Chad Mongol, I suppose. I remember reading a stat years ago that basically, like, if anybody who has any amount of blood in them east of a certain point was probably related to Genghis Khan, because he had so many thousands of children,
Progeny, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah. Let me get back then. We'll probably hit the super chats after this, but what about the concerted agenda part of it? So yes, you could say, well, various different experts were giving advice, but maybe they were giving it in earnest, like they genuinely they done research and they drawn incorrect conclusions, but they were just innocent scientists at the end of the day. What makes it more kind of sinister or more an agenda in your mind, Tristan?
There's a lot of different ways we can look at this, right? But I think we can look at it from a purely economic standpoint. I'm not attached to any specific approach to this. I think there are many reasons why this agenda gets pushed, but one of them is clearly economic, right? Consolidation of resources, genetically modified soybean, genetically modified corn, right? These are patented seeds, and these are processes of production that require heavy machinery, IMF loans. So a lot of this is just bringing the population to heel under a consolidated global monopoly system run by, a consolidated, to a certain extent, consolidated oligarchy. Now, I know there is competition at higher levels as well, but there's that aspect of it, right? The Rockefeller Foundation helped to fund the Green Revolution, telling everybody that we're going to feed the world, we're going to save the planet. But really, there was an economic interest there. I think one could bring, we talked about Malthus earlier. There are certain aspects of the regime that do wish to decrease the population, at least certain parts of the population, and essentially control human breeding, right? That's one aspect. You look at David Pearce, Pearce. He started Humanity Plus, and he's a transhumanist, and he actually has this crazy religious fervor for transforming man and transforming all of nature, right? He says we should get rid of all predator species. We should, basically we should put condoms on lions and genetically modify all predator species to get rid of them and just run the whole world as a giant zoo and dominate it with our superior transhumanist system that will make a perfect utopia. So there are different ways of thinking that you see among people who push this. You also have World Economic Forum types who are pushing for plant-based diets, bug-based diets, and there is both a Malthusian aspect to this, of Malthusian aspect as in these people want to reduce human population to manageable levels and manage and even mutate manage every level of man from the cellular and molecular biological level up to the social level. You've got that aspect that Klaus Schwab and the WEF sort of represent. So yeah, I think there are various ways to look at this. Now, when you use the word sinister, that's going to imply, you know, things like an objective morality, an objective truth existing, and that brings us back to the revolutionary worldview, where there is no objective truth, there is no objective morality. It's just might makes right. I think that's an incorrect view, right? Like I think that's a demonic worldview that results in destruction, self-destruction. And St. Justin Popovich said that deicide ultimately leads to suicide, because if you do believe that we're made in the image and likeness of God, if you're going to kill God, you're killing the image and likeness of God in man as well. So man becomes something, this malleable mutant, an abomination, a giant abortion that needs to essentially be eliminated. Because if man is made in the image and likeness of God, and the ideal culture would be built if we just get rid of God from culture, that leaves man as just a simple beast. Man is an animal to be controlled, to be mutated, and to be exterminated if we so see fit. So I think that kind of gives a little basic overview of it. I think it is sinister, the idea in and of itself that we need to modify, mutate, and control all of humanity. And I think this stems from a kind of Promethean and revolutionary ideology that is metaphysical in nature. And it's ideological, but it's also a religious quest at a certain level for a lot of people. So I tend to see that as the most fundamental moving part of this whole agenda. So yeah, the Economist magazine said that 2019 is the year of the vegan. Right? The World Economic Forum is saying we need to reduce animal food consumption. You got to eat the bugs. You got to live in the pod. Right now, a lot of the big banks are saying this fertilizer crisis, which is totally engineered, resulting from Putin's war of aggression and Putin's big bad mean evil man Putin, Putler's aggressive invasion. Right, this is all the reason for rising gas prices and rising cost of fertilizer. But then they're also saying, well, this is maybe good because we wanted to reduce fertilizer use anyways. We wanted to make farming a fully industrialized and centralized, highly efficient, and centrally planned system where essentially rural people are phased out, where the family farm is disappeared, which it already has to a large extent. And they're saying
it was interesting. Sorry to interrupt you, Tristan. It was interesting about the fertilizer, because I was talking to Mrs. AA yesterday, and just saying, like, you know, this is not some weird prepper thing. We probably want to get some tinned food in just in case, because, you know, if this if they don't find this fertilizer, there's going to be like a, you know, the yields in the harvest in September are going to be below, you know, where they usually are, and we could get shortages, and we don't want to be, you know, we just want to be ready. And she responded with something that I couldn't really answer. She just said, well, if they know this is happening, why don't they just make this fertilizer themselves? Why, like, surely we know how to make fertilizer, and surely in a crisis we could just, like, you know, convert some factories or open up some spaces, and we'd be able to do it. You know, do you happen to know anything about that? Like, do either of you know why Russia or Ukraine has to make the fertilizer? Why can't it be made here?
In part, I'll be brief, Tristan, because you've probably got something worthwhile to say with this as well. But just from like the standpoint of, you know, coming from this background, as you know, we've canvassed this, I think, twice on your streams, and I've done. Yeah. I think I spoke about this with Mr. Patriarch and also Uncle Radlib. So, you know, this has been canvassed a bit. And for anyone who's interested in like the farmer's perspective side of it, I would recommend anyone watching the streams, because they're quite good. We managed to sort of delve into some of the economic aspects of it. But you do remember in that first stream AA that we did, I sort of emphasized like the whole Australia is being sold from underneath itself, and elites are not only sort of indifferent to it, but they're facilitating it. Like, they're actually welcoming what we call foreign investment into the country. And, you know, like I sort of said, you know, these family farms, you know, they struggle to make ends meet. And, you know, when droughts happen, you know, they don't get support. And, you know, they're small little micro societies, which country towns tend to become eviscerated. And they're not, you know, the public sort of state doesn't
exist to support them. Because let's face it, if you look at the way liberalism goes, and Cthulhu always swimming left, agriculturalists are their enemy in a way. And I mean, that's why Patriarch Stream was called Enemies of Agriculture, because that's exactly what they are. And so it makes them ripe to be sort of overtaken. And inversely, we've also spoken, because I know economics is sort of very much your home ground, AA, and we've talked about like like the Clinton era and the sort of the intentional deindustrialization of the USA. And there's also, to some degree, a wider deindustrialization of the West, because one country it's happened most profoundly is here. I mean, when my parents came to Australia, 60 odd years ago, 55 years ago, Australia made tractors. We don't make a single tractor in this country. Up until I left high school, Nissan, Toyota, we Ford, and we have Holden, but that's Vauxhall in Britain, or Chevrolet in America, right? Had factories here. In the last 15, 20 years, they've all closed down. It's not only that you use the physical infrastructure, you lose the physical infrastructure, and you're like, oh, it's World War II, let's just stop making fridges and we'll make tanks and airplanes, like the old World War II propaganda posters. We have lost the capacity in terms of the resource base. We've lost the infrastructure to sort of dig up things like gypsum or quicklime or guano, if you want to go back in time, and actually process these materials into fertilizer. And a lot of the expertise don't exist here anymore, because we've essentially subcontracted these industries beyond our countries, and it's so far removed from our like our sort of short-term collective memory. It's like, oh crap, now that we've globalized our economy, we can't deglobalize it.
I was gonna make a video on this soon, and I will, after I make my breed them out rebuttal to Dutton and Turley. I'm also going to make a video basically taking on Ludwig von Mises and basic free trade theory, because one of the things that seems to have been forgotten along the line is that when Ricardo was talking about like bottles of wine in Portugal and fucking t-shirts in England or whatever it was, okay, he assumed that the capital, which is to say not only the money but the infrastructure, is fixed, right? That means when you move production of, I don't know, what like t-shirts out of your country, the factory and the money invested in it doesn't leave the country. It gets reallocated to what they call more productive ends. The other thing that is held as being fixed is labor. And one of the things that has happened since really the mid 70s, but it accelerated in the 90s under Clinton and Blair, was it happened in under Thatcher and Reagan as well, was basically the freeing up of those things which had always been held constant, i.e. now you can have massive changes to the labor market, either through mass immigration or the mass outsourcing of jobs. And the other thing that you can have is so like when Ricardo was figuring out like basic free trade theory, he never in a million years imagined that Apple would simply just fucking pull out of every American city and just build their factory in China, right? They didn't. That's not part of the equation.
The concept of complete industrial relocation would have been foreign to them, essentially, because that's what that is basically. Relocation of entire industrial bases.
It's weird. Like we started the stream with Malthus and how Malthus never foresaw that. The free trade economists, but Ricardo especially, never foresaw a time where he was just like, well, you're never going to be able to move the population of Britain to some other place or move the population of, like, he never dreamed that you could get like a city the size of Newcastle moving to the UK every day. But he also didn't dream that governments would ever relax enough, I guess, to basically like sell all of the assets of a country to another country, right? So like he never would envisage that you'd deindustrialize, that you'd get rid of all of your capacity for production, because it just wouldn't have occurred to him, because nobody did that then.
Yeah, it would be a completely foreign concept.
But he also explicitly states it as an assumption in the analysis. And Mises repeats this in Human Action, and it's one of those things that I think libertarians are going to have to because what I find is that when these things come up, and they're defending free trade and free market and so on, they forget that those two things were meant to have been held constant, and it changes everything. Once you realize that the situation Ricardo was talking about was highly specific and held so many different things fixed, it changes the whole calculus of how you think about trade in general, because it's obvious that this has had disastrous consequences not only for Australia but for Britain, and I mean America still has some manufacturing capability, but it's even now we see the likes of Joe Biden just deliberately closing down the Keystone pipeline and so on and so forth. So when you look at it that way, it does start to look deliberate what they've done.
Absolutely. Yeah. And as well on that notion is that how many times, because I know our dear friend Mr. Tim Pool always likes to utter the saying that what is it? Don't ascribe to malfeasance what can be described as ineptitude or whatever that phrase is. I actually think it's more true in reverse. Like I honestly am at the point now where I consider that, and the more left wing one goes in their political orientation, I think the more shameless this act actually is, because the ineptitude is merely a front for the malfeasance, and then these people can mea culpa themselves, ad infinitum, and then for all of the negative policy and the negative consequences, and the in the case of whether one considers say like the disintegration of rural communities, whether it's like this mass mental health crisis amongst the youth, whether it's the fact that 50, 60 years ago our parents used to leave the keys in their ignition, their houses unlocked, and nowadays you bolt yourself up like your own personal Alcatraz for fear of being robbed, whether it's the fact that people go through 12 years of education and they can barely read and write and enter the workforce and actually, be able to have any concept of language, or even we've just been speaking on economic terms, like the fact that these political leaders have just intentionally deindustrialized our countries, and whoever pays the price for being wrong, there's actually no consequences. And for anyone who's read Donald Kagan's,
the people always they socialize the costs and cash the benefits, as always.
Exactly right. And I mean, for anyone who's familiar with Donald Kagan's Peloponnesian War, which is an excellent book, actually, and anyone who has an interest, even like a vague interest in classical history, I recommend that book because you can learn a lot from an analysis of the Peloponnesian War. But there's an interesting, because this is where we get the idea of, firstly, hyperbole as a word, and secondly, the notion of ostracism. And in Athens, during like a hinge point of the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, there's actually a more or less a deadlock between the pro-war side, led by a man named Cleon, and the peaceniks, you might say, led by a man called Nicetas. And one man stands up to try and break the deadlock in the Athenian assembly. His name is Hyperbolos, right? Hence, we have the word hyperbole. And he called for an ostracism. And ostracism would apply to three people: the person who calls it, in this case, Hyperbolos, and he could announce two other people, in which case he announced Nicetas and Cleon. And can anyone guess which of the three ended up being exiled from Athens? It was of course Hyperbolos. So the peaceniks and the pro-war party basically ganged up together to exile the man who tried to break a deadlock that was expedient for both parties. There you go. But at least a politician paid a consequence. Like nowadays, it doesn't happen.
So shall we do the super chats? Because I don't want to go into a fourth hour today. Let us hit a few super chats. Hugh James just says melted Swiss cheese, roasted mushrooms, and caramelized onions. That's hot stuff. Yeah. I posted that there was a girl on Twitter saying like, "Give me your best chat up line," and I just posted that the other day. So it's been on everybody's mind again.
Can I just correct myself just briefly, AA? Sorry, the chats, a few of my boys from AM channel. Yes, sorry, Nikias, not Nikitas. I'm mistaken. Yes, it was Nikias who was the Nikias who was the leader of the pro peace party in Athens. Yes, I just wanted to fix that up. Sorry, continue.
Time Stealer says Ceterum censeo delenda est semen olea. I hope I didn't like cast a magic spell or something.
No, it's seed oil. Its seed oils must be destroyed in Latin, but because of the connotation we have with the S word, is why I use granum rather than the S word, because everyone's like, oh, you know.
Yeah, no, the vegans are always like, when you have milk, when you're eating butter, that's literally pus and blood filled mammary excretions from bovines, right? It's like when you have your almond milk, you are eating tree jizz. Like that's literally you disgusting perverted vegans. So
and also they call eggs butt periods, isn't that right?
Yeah, chicken periods, which is like chickens don't have periods. I mean, these are eggs.
Here's the eunuch says, being healthy isn't complicated. Eat reasonably sized portions of local meats and veggies. Don't eat garbage like fast food, factory made snacks and soda. Get plenty of low impact daily exercise like walking, tending the garden, simple as. I mean, I always remember somebody said once the best diet is, if it walks, if it swims, if it flies, and if it grows in the ground, eat it. Being everything else, basically. Sounds about right to me, to be honest. Although, don't go eating a dog or a cat unless you're Chinese. Coney says, to sum this all up into something simple, what should I replace my rapeseed oil to cook with?
I would say tallow, lard, butter are going to be superior. Coconut oil is fine. You can doesn't oxidize at high temperature. You want to avoid the polyunsaturated fatty acid oils.
Yeah, and a good advice for anyone who, because this cropped up a few times in the chat, it also tends to on other streams. But if anyone who is asking about steak and particularly high temperature frying, I can highly recommend macadamia nut oil or avocado oil. They are also very good for or ghee for cooking steaks and that sort of thing.
What's wrong with butter? I do steaks and butter.
Well, butter's wonderful, but the thing with butter is that ghee is butter without the milk solid. See, the fat itself is fine, but the milk component tends to smoke with high temperature. Right. Which is why I don't know if you ever watched like a cooking show, AA, but if they ever like cook a steak and then like finish it off with butter, it's because by that stage they've turned off the gas and there's a lower temperature in the pan. But that's just details; it doesn't particularly matter.
Yeah. Incidentally, I think you guys calling tallow, we tend to call beef dripping in this country.
Yeah, that's what it is. Beef drippings, beef fat.
JS says Nuremberg trials for anyone who was involved with the McGovern report and the design of the food pyramid. Narco Republican says eat the manatee, sleep in the hut, pray to the tree.
Based.
I am curious about the manatee.
It is intriguing, isn't it?
Yeah, although I probably, you guys have got me in the mood for a steak later on.
Mr. D's in the chat. I see you, Mr. D, groping the chat.
Bakari says these two men should berate you for the burger problem you confessed to earlier. Also, American corn syrup, Coca-Cola tastes absolutely disgusting compared to European Coke. Yeah, I do have basically a burger addiction. How can I solve this?
Well, if you just stop having it with the bun and just eat the rest, it doesn't sound as appetizing. You don't get the crunch factor really. But yeah, if you remove the bun, cheese and like a burger patty with some cheese on it, and you throw some tomatoes and whatnot, you'd probably be better off long term. And if you make it yourself, you can remove any possible vegetable oil contamination.
Revival Herald says, I wonder how this affects GH levels. I'm pretty sure those act as the same pathways as insulin, IFG1. This means they compete to bind the same receptors. Zoomers have the lowest recorded GH levels in history because you have found the cause. Perhaps you have found the cause.
And also, growth hormone too is responsible for, things such as bone structure, muscle structure, your capacity to build muscle. And if for instance, you train, you're engaged in a repair cycle after training. if you have low growth hormone, you can eat as many, I mean, within reason, but you can eat a bundle of calories and you can rest as much as you want. But if you actually have chronically low growth hormone, which, for anyone who's aware of how the body works, for instance, if you know of anyone with a pituitary injury, pituitary gland, where you produce, which is like almost the control room for where the humans sort of regulate hormones. If in the absence of growth hormones, you basically can't repair or grow your body. And what that super chat is making reference to is that, it is indispensable to have growth hormone. And for these things in our diet that sort of curtail growth hormone, of course, you're going to end up with a weaker and less healthy populace, because, ultimately, if you can't repair yourself, you can't heal. If you can't heal, you become chronically ill. And you become chronically ill, it makes you a very good consumer, and it makes you a very good client for Big Pharma, and ultimately a docile subject to the elites. What can I say?
Years the Eunuch says, I eat only locally raised grown pork, trout, eggs, butter, garlic, onions, tomatoes, potatoes, and peppers. My doctors tell me I'm healthier than 99% of high school students, and I'm in my 40s. All right, Years, that may well be the case. But can you do a Hadouken without looking it up? All right, let's move on. Ralph says offal is the true superfood. I mean, one thing I'll say is in my travels to Italy, Furious, they sell a lot of offal in the markets there, and like cow stomach and things like that,
What the Italians call tripe or tripe.
Tripe, yeah.
Yes, and Italians love their trotters and things like that, sinews and chicken livers and stuff. Yes.
Go on then, Years. If you know how to do it without looking it up, tell me. How do you do a Hadouken without looking it up? You must. You either know it or you don't. No looking it up.
Just while you're on that tangent, I just want to say there's a comment here from D. I know D and I like to spar on this issue for shits and giggles, but D says, "Eat what you like, avoid crap processed food, don't be a pig." I actually fundamentally agree with that. That is actually what people should aim for as a baseline. And I know, like, I completely accept the charge and the accusation that I'm a zealot on this question, but it's because it is so endemic in our society and it damages people so much. But, okay, for example, right, I caught up with family today. I actually had pizza. I haven't had pizza since before Christmas last year. But, I was with family, and I mean, I'm Italian. I actually love a nice, pasta or pizza, whatever. And I was with family and I just had some, like, you don't have to be like a freaking Shaolin monk about it. But D is right. Just live responsibly, live well, make good choices, be judicious, try and do the right thing 90-95% of the time. And you know what? Occasionally treat yourself. It isn't going to be the end of the world. I just want to say to D, I do agree with that.
Yeah, if I could throw my 2 cents into it, that's absolutely right. Eat what you can digest, eat what you'll like, right? But not everybody's going to be the same in their ability to digest certain foods, right? So like, from my perspective, I'm coming from a background of having certain health problems that had to be managed through the avoidance of certain types of food. And it's really easy to avoid those certain types of food if you see the repercussions in your health, right? In your digestion, or if you're having, some sort of chronic illness. Like I deal with a lot of people who have, ulcerative colitis, right? If you got ulcerative colitis, it's not going to be eat what you want, right? Because maybe what you want to eat is helping to exacerbate the symptoms. But for most people, it's like, look, try to avoid the processed foods. What are the processed foods? It's the high fructose corn syrup, the refined sugar, the refined wheat flour, and the vegetable oils. If you avoid the processed foods, if you cook for yourself, eat what you want. It's not like carbs are bad or fat is bad. But for some people, their health becomes such a problem that they got to dial it in a little bit more. So eat what you can digest. Eat what you enjoy. Don't make your diet into a religion, because that's freaking obnoxious. But there are cultural issues that are contributing to obesity, cancer rates, diabetes, and whatnot. And a lot of people are getting screwed up by this processed food crap.
Is it fair to say, Tristan, that if it's like a ready meal, or if you get takeaway, or if you get anything from a restaurant, you can basically, unless it's like a specialist place, assume they'll have stuck the seed oils in it somewhere.
Well, look, you can ask them. I mean, you don't want to be, again, if you're eating out every meal, what's wrong with you? Quit being a degenerate, right? Learn to make some food, But yeah, a lot of restaurants are going to use this. It doesn't mean you should avoid all restaurant foods, but if you cook for yourself most of the time, you're going to save money. It's a good economic decision to make, and you're going to pass those economic decisions and health decisions on to your children. And you can ask restaurants, be like, hey, if you're going to, could you use butter instead of vegetable oil when you make my steak? Simple stuff like that. They'll have butter around, right? They might have coconut oil or something. You could ask them. And, I mean, I've worked in hospitality. They're not going to get annoyed with you unless you're a prick, right?
Just
you
be
can
polite
ask,
about it,
what are you using? Talk to your waitress, ask a question or two. Don't be a prick, and don't drive yourself nuts and turn yourself into a meat-based, basically vegan who's just, spouting about seed oils to everybody and telling everybody that every problem they have is because they're not as pure in their diet as you are.
Yeah.
Because that's obnoxious.
Yeah, Marcus. Anyway, Monothalmus. Monothalmus says,
well played, sir. Well played.
Yes, I can see you showing off now. Okay. All right. Everybody knows how to do a hard who can. What about in Mortal Kombat 2, right, with Shang Tsung? How do you do the 3 fireballs when you can shoot 3 fireballs on the bot? If you can do that, I'll give you a special cookie. Okay.
Can you transform into Sub-Zero? I mean,
Yeah. Well, I used to remember. I used to be able to do them all, but just that's all I want. How do you throw the 3 fireballs with Shang Tsung in Mortal Kombat 2? What are the commands? Okay. Monothalmus says that cursed photo of Emma Watson is more blackpilling for me than the entire Ashes of Civilization combined. I included the photo of Watson, by the way, not only as a piece of clickbait, but also because I believe she's a vegan. Is that right?
I think she's what people call like a mostly vegan, like someone who's sort of vegetarian with an inclination to be vegan, but like with the occasional piece of fish or something or other. That's how she describes herself. I don't think she's totally sort of animal product free, but mostly so. But given her stature and probably her circle of friends and family, I doubt that her meat consumption and collagen consumption is sort of high enough to regenerate her tissue, and hence why she looks a bit, dare I say, anemic. Actually, I just want to you keep reading the super chats. Hey, I just want to try and find a photo for you which sort of compares 2 people. But keep going. I'll link it to you in a second.
Can I just throw this, like, angle and lighting and stuff like that can also come into play. So, I mean, she ain't looking good, but you take a picture of any woman without the proper angle and lighting. A lot of these Hollywood celebs, they're only looking hot because it's under certain conditions do they look hot. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Incidentally, just off the top of my head, forward, down, forward, and high punch was the Sub-Zero transformation. I only know that because I used to immediately turn into Sub-Zero before Shang Tsung.
Oh, there you go. I anticipated that. Hey, just before we move on to the next super chat, I just sent you a YouTube short. It's only like a few seconds, but play it and let's compare one of the leading carnivore advocates with a prominent celebrity who's been vegan for 25 years. Just in the private chat on Streamlabs. It's only a tiny 20-second YouTube short.
Is it called "I Believe He Believes His Nonsense"?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And I'll go mute, so we'll just listen.
Is that Moby? I think it's Moby.
What's left of him is Moby.
Is that Moby? Speaking of the mid-90s.
35 years, I've been repeatedly asked the simple question, why am I a vegan? And I actually think a better question is, why isn't everyone? Because I'm a vegan because I care about animals and I don't want to contribute to their suffering and death. I care about climate change, and we know that animal agriculture is the 3rd leading cause of climate change. I care about human health, and we know that eating animals and animal products causes heart disease, cancer, diabetes, etc. I care about the rainforest. I care about the workers. I care about communities. I care about water. It seems like everything is decimated by the production of meat and dairy. So really, I do believe the question is not why am I a vegan, but why isn't everyone? I've been
Oh God.
Not everyone wants to look like you, Moby.
I mean,
I love that thing
Moby,
at the end, though, that little meme at the end.
bloody Moby.
You put him and Emma Watson together without, makeup or anything. They're just going to look like, some meth heads on Skid Row in LA.
God. Okay. Where were we?
And just for anyone who's interested, someone did say it in the chat, but the guy on the right is Dr. Sean Baker. And for anyone who just even has an interest in this or wants to investigate further, his content's fantastic. I'm sure, Tristan, you'd know him well.
Yeah, Sean Baker's great. I mean, he eats nothing but meat, like basically steaks is his whole diet. I'm not saying everybody should do that. Some people end up
and
there.
indeed, neither am I.
Yeah, Sean Baker's fun. He's awesome.
But Monothalmus says, Shuro Seguno says, look up myelin sheath that ends veganism. Look up myelin sheath that ends veganism. Oh God, what am I going to look up now? I'm going to see if.
But myelin sheaths, and they're made from cholesterol, right? You need animal fat for your central nervous system, and lack of animal fats will lead to a degradation of this, and neurodegenerative diseases. When you look at Moby, he looks like his myelin sheath is quite shriveled.
Slawla Boga says, AA, I heard a rumor that Polish leaders, aides, keep walking into rooms and the leaders keep hiding historical maps from the 1600s hastily under the table, and they all have started growing big moustaches. Okay, I don't know what that's a reference to. JD says, anti-meat views began with attacks on saturated fats. Awful observational studies that didn't examine biology or metabolic health. Joseph Langmead says, why is the UK so cucked? How are there more dissidents in literal Canada and Australia than the UK? This is embarrassing and perhaps worth a video. Well, yeah, that's in reference to my earlier video where I tried to calculate the total amount of dissidents in each country. Essentially, what my methodology was total number of unvaxxed times the percentage of I used a 0.42, so 42% of unvaxxed people is about the number of people who are unvaxxed who also are not believing the government narrative on Ukraine conflict, which is like basically like Vladimir Putin is the new Hitler, blah 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 blah. And that's only 42% of unvaxxed people. So I use that to calculate, well, how many people is that in each country? And I worked out that there were about double the percentage-wise, there are double the amount of dissidents in Australia and Canada, and all in Europe as well, than there are in the UK, which surprised me. I wouldn't have thought that going in, but does that surprise you, Furious, that there were so many in the Australian unvax rate is huge?
Well, the thing is, I hear sort of conflicting reports, and I hear sort of almost blackpilling levels of vax, and then I sort of hear these other figures that are at a low. In some ways, no, I do have something of a theory called the she'll be right principle, and for anyone who's ever met an Australian, that is a ubiquitous statement that we also use for any situation. And as much as it's made the Australian difficult to indoctrinate initially, it's also why they have found all of their institutions subsumed, because they just simply didn't care enough. But I have a feeling the winds are changing, and I mean, we are all actually, well, not Tristan, but I mean, that's not the point. Most of us in our circles here are familiar with our your moderator here, Lady of Shalott, who's really in the belly of the beast in her situation, and the cynicism and the pushback against some of the measures passed here has actually been quite gallant, given our isolation and quite literally the fact that we're surrounded by water. And I think I think in some ways, when I actually consider some of the like, for instance, you're doing that stream on Wednesday, and you're going to have that young fella on who's sort of for my circles, and a very intelligent and erudite young man. And there is sort of this generation of younger people who actually do care and who do wish to peel back these layers of BS that we've sort of been told about and whatever. And there's this interesting thing occurs, you know, like on the, what you might call on the perimeter of civilization, or like on the edge of empire, you do get these diamonds in the rough, you know. I mean, I'm only just one of a hand of many, but we do produce them, you know. And Canada's produced a few. You got to think there's Endeavour over in Canada, and there's you know, our friend Skeptical Ways. There's a bunch of them there.
I actually have an alternative theory for why the UK is so cut compared to some of these other countries, and that is it's very simple. It is the strength of the Tory party in this country. The Tory party.
I agree with you on that take, AA. I've heard you say it before, and I actually agree with you that the British Tories is the ultimate psyop of suppression of dissident thought.
They're masters of taking something and containing it and smothering it, and now they're doing this move where the more you can call for nuclear war with Russia, the more Tory, the more like it's kind of like this weird thing of like you have to be, if you can show yourself to be more extreme than even the leftists on this issue, you're kind of signaling your masculine. Like this is like a version of kind of weird masculine. It like you're being patriotic and masculine if you're calling for nuclear war with Putin.
Churchill biscuit tin bulldog nationalism, that's superficial but obvious, right?
What I'm saying is it's extremely effective at reining in these dissident elements on the right, and they're much better at it than the GOP is in America, to the extent where you'd never get a Trump in this country because the Tories would just cut it off at the legs, as they did to Enoch Powell. So
correct, and I think in some ways too, because of the enduring, the very long, extensive history of basically Parliament and parliamentarianism in England, is that, or by Britain, I suppose, by and large, is that in some way different to America and Australia and other countries where, you know, the centre left is what we would call the inner party. If we talk about the inner party and the outer party, right? You know, the Democrats are the inner party in America. Australian Labor is the inner party here. It's the party of the institutions and the unions and the academia, etc. The same is true, I would say, in Italy with the Social Democrats there. It's probably true in France as well. But in Britain, it is probably fair to say, and I agree with your assessment here, that in fact it is the Tories that are the inner party, and it's the only case where there's an obvious inversion of that principle.
Yeah, and it's a very, very clever mechanism though, because because right wingers are very easily misdirected, as people should have been able to see in the past 4 or 5 years. Like they'll have every narrative shift you get put, and the people who have been most insane on Ukraine are actually like former friends of ours, or nominally friends, or like someone like Helen Dale, right, who is very anti-woke, very right wing, on all other issues, but now she's calling anybody who's against the narrative on that traitors. They need to be deplatformed. They shouldn't be allowed on TV. This is someone who's been fighting like woke censorship for the past decade. Do you know what I mean? So
totally.
And anyway,
if you don't mind, if I could just pipe in real quick to bring this back to the fertilizer thing, right? The Ukraine situation, blaming Russia for the fertilizer, blaming Russia for inflation and the rise in fuel prices and stuff. The lack of fertilizer and the fertilizer crisis, I've been talking about this since at least September, October of last year. This is something that was happening well before the military campaign. So lack of fertilizer, this is something that's going to be leveraged in order to crush small family farms. So what I think is really important that we understand is we don't need to be reliant on this fertilizer in the first place. If we have properly integrated animal husbandry in the farm system still, we wouldn't be relying on external fertilizer and chemical fertilizer, right? Like, so small scale farming, subsistence farming, as you see in a lot of places like the Appalachians, these people are not using heavy inputs of fertilizer. So if you look into the work of like Alan Savory, regenerative agriculture, intensive grazing techniques, you can effectively and efficiently use animals to improve the quality of your soil, to build up your soil, and to feed your local population. So it's like what we do here. We've got cows, sheep, goats, pigs, chickens, and ducks, and we use the fertilizer to fertilize the land. What a crazy concept, right? Not using heavy tilling, not using any tilling, not using heavy machinery or chemical fertilizers that need to be imported. This is actually a solid answer to the problems that we're going to be facing that's going to result in a food crisis, right? So this was avoidable, and we can avoid it in the future, having future food crises by locally produced foods, using animal integration on farms like we always have done.
And just very briefly, just to buttress Tristan here, is that I might be sort of delving a little bit into Alex Jones tinfoil land here, but we've often talked about how past generation, like the boomers and the silent generation, whatever, sort of like cashed in on the present to sort of sell out the future to some degree, like whether it's cheap consumable goods and exporting industries overseas for the sake of purchasing power and debasing the dollar to sort of pay for today's bills at the expense of tomorrow's borrowings, etc. Right? Mm-hmm. I think this is also true to some degree of agriculture, in that in the pursuit for just maximal output and this insane, almost relentless drive for efficiency. And I have to admit that people I know, and even my own family to some degree, have been psych-opted into this via agronomy and industry groups, etc. Right? Have done this, and maybe there's a thread to explore that with this shortage of fertilizers and other stuff because of the war that's going on, rather than there being an irrefutable case of, yes, we have destroyed the biodiversity of our topsoils. We have denatured these topsoils and our earth of minerals and nutrients that are making these growing crops more and more unnourishing and have less and less vitamins and minerals that we need to sustain ourselves and whatever. That we now just have here comes the narrative pivot. You've seen me use that terminology before, AA. Here comes the narrative pivot. It's Putin's fault. It's the war. We have no fertilizers. We can't grow stuff. And so rather than that sort of irrefutable problem cropping up in 5, 10, 15 years where the topsoil is destroyed, we can just blame Russia now, And of course, our elites get away with it yet again. I don't know if that's true. I'm not saying it's certain, but I'm just saying that's possibly a theory.
They'll blame Russia, they'll blame climate change, but the solution's always the same, right? It's move into your pod, give up private property, sterilize yourselves, and eat the kibble in your coon pod, and you will save the planet. Now, look, I mean, somebody in the chat said that subsistence farming isn't going to feed everyone. Yeah, obviously, but if it was feeding everybody for a long time, this massive industrial agriculture system has degraded our soil. It's been sold to us under the guise of efficiency and feeding the world. But the Green Revolution, I would argue that the Green Revolution was a failure. The crop yields are not higher with the industrial model. The requirement for technology, for tilling, for big IMF loans for a lot of the third world, this has resulted in more inefficiency, but it's highly profitable. So I think, at least supporting local food production. And I'm not like trying to LARP here and say that we're going to create some utopia and everyone's just going to like grow their own food or some gay idea like that. But it's like we should be supporting local food production and integrated farm systems using animals allows us to fertilize without having heavy inputs from other countries and globalization.
One of the things that I saw was that McDonald's pulled out of Russia. Now I haven't had this confirmed because some people are claiming that it could be a fake, right? I.e., it's not real. Somebody's mocked up a picture of it, but I did see a story going around that those McDonald's in Russia, where McDonald's have pulled out, obviously the infrastructure is still there, the employees are still there, the franchise holders are still there. That basically all of those restaurants are going to reopen as something else. It was said that they'll turn the M onto its side and it'll become like a B. I can't remember what it stands for, but the prices will be like almost halved, with the foreign company no longer involved in the process. All of the ingredients for the Russian McDonald's, if you want, sourced locally. I thought, well, could Russia, in a strange way, by having a more autarkic, it's not autarky, but like a more self-sufficient economy than we have been used to, show the rest of the world the possible way to go with this?
You might call it self-sufficiency with supplementation, shall we say?
Yeah. Now, obviously, Russia have some advantages because they have a lot of resources in-house. Not every country has that. But, I mean, certainly when it comes to food, I mean, you'd hope that Europe would be able to feed itself.
Yeah, it's almost like this isolation of Russia economically. Well, Russia's been preparing for it, obviously, for a long time.
Yeah.
They've seen this coming, but that it may result in a non-reliant Russia and perhaps the empowering of Russia, which I don't know.
But just the idea, though, Tristan, that McDonald's pull out and the prices go down. I mean, what better way to refute kind of like global international trade theories? Like, well, the prices are meant to go up, not the other way. But what's the benefit of globalism if it's artificially keeping the prices double what they should be?
You'll absolutely discredited it. It'll discredit the system. And to be honest with you, I wouldn't be surprised if it's been in their back pocket. Like Tristan said, they've been preparing for this for a long time. And if anything, the elites depend on the reputation of this system, kind of like the Fukuyama mindset of, we are at the end of history, it's liberal democracy and we're at the last hurdle and this will be forever and ever in perpetuity because we are the best and we are peerless and we are faultless and we're like, this is the absolute zenith of the post-Jacobin movement. There's nothing afterwards. And then Russia comes along and said, niet tovarich, no friend, and proves the system wrong. They pull the plug from underneath itself and let's see how it pans out. If we get someone said they're McDonald's or McDonald's, let's see how the Russians fancy with their own take on Macca's.
It should, like, on the face of it, it should be absurd that it's cheaper to farm a fucking potato or a carrot. It's cheaper to source it from a man sitting from people 3,000, 4,000 miles away. I mean, this is like we're used to thinking in this way, but on the face of it, like, it shouldn't pass the common sense test. It should be obviously cheaper to source it from down the road.
I think Russia's in a unique position too, as far as their resources, right? And Ukraine has historically been a breadbasket of Europe and the world, right? I think they were producing like 90% of the wheat for Europe before the Bolsheviks took over. Under Tsar Nicholas II, Russia was actually very well off economically. Now, you look at like the Russo-Japanese War, the World War I. The argument could be made that a lot of what was happening politically was an attempt to essentially, get rid of the Tsar and get rid of Russia as a potential power and prevent Russia and Germany from participating together and cooperating. But yeah, Russia's in a unique position. So like none of these South American countries are going to be able to, like Venezuela can't handle their economy in the way that Putin is able to.
It's interesting you say that, Tristan, because I've got on this channel back in my back catalogue the economic policies that ruined Venezuela. Venezuela was pretty much food self-sufficient before Hugo Chavez, believe it or not. They actually did because they put certain capital controls on, and he reorientated the economy to be almost entirely towards selling oil. Right? They became over-reliant on exporting oil to the detriment of all other things. And similar to what we've been talking about, they lost their agricultural capacity. So they went from being a net food producer to being a net food importer in Venezuela. That happened,
which is a keystone of a country's ability to be self-sufficient and sovereign. If you are at the behest of others for food, you are more vulnerable than any other country on that standpoint alone, with the exception of a military. A military and food, and by that extension, water as well. With one of those three things missing, your country just cannot be sovereign and self-sufficient. Like, they are the bedrock of it.
Yeah. So let's carry. I mean,
just quick on that topic. AA, just check the private chat. I just dropped an image. Just throw it up.
Okay.
In Streamlabs. Yeah. Like, it's a joke, but it's so true. Like the power of memes.
Pears grown in Argentina, packed into Thailand. Yeah, well,
like,
exactly.
How the hell does it make sense? This is so dumb.
Green. Yeah, green. But I was just going to say that whole series I did, the economic policies that ruin series. The common feature of pretty much, I can't remember how many countries I looked at, 7, 8 different countries. The common feature of all of them is that as soon as the government sticks its nose in farms and food production, it always goes tits up from that moment. Whether you call it land reform or you call it like, that is the moment it goes from like, oh, they were doing all right, to, oh, this is a humanitarian disaster. You know, Zimbabwe, Ethiopia. I mean, Zimbabwe used to be the breadbasket of Africa. Ethiopia had that problem. What else? Haiti was another one where they had this fucking stupid system where they parceled out land to everybody, and then they had this rule that each child would inherit an equal portion. So you ended up with people getting like ever smaller little chunks of land. So
Absolute egalitarianism, you know,
like real stupidity like that. And I'm just saying that when like, to come back to what you guys were talking about earlier on, when you see the World Economic Forum and Bill Gates and all of these sorts of characters messing around in the food supply and in the farming, it should be a source of concern to everybody, because that is always the moment where things become like awful, not just totalitarian, but like disastrous for the people. Not disastrous, incidentally, for the elites. You know, Robert Mugabe, he was able to rule for what, like 40, 50 years. And
never answer for his crimes, by the way.
Yeah, he died. I mean, you know, he was overthrown just before he died, but he basically didn't face trial for anyone. Like the Bolsheviks never paid for their crimes in Ukraine, etc., etc.
But Milosevic did, you know. But
Milosevic never starved. Yeah, Milosevic never starved his population, though. You know.
Yeah.
Right. All right.
I think like a healthy agrarian population that's really important, and that's something that we're seeing being attacked constantly. You saw the Bolsheviks do it. You see in the World Economic Forum do it now. And I think the agrarian way of life is much more fulfilling in many ways. Like the mental illness levels in small towns are much lower than they are in high population density cities. The quality of life is much better. People tend to be more real. It's like the old, was it Phil? No, it wasn't Phil Collins. It was Peter Gabriel, the Genesis song, where it's like, I'd rather trust the countryman than a town man. You could tell by the way he works with his hands. So I forget the lyric, but that principle of, you know, country folk kind of being salt of the earth, solid people, I find that very true. And I think in the US especially, people who raise food, people who live this agrarian life, they're portrayed as being poor white trash. They're portrayed as being these
inbred Christian bigots. You know,
they're bigoted, they're racist, they're awful. You know, they're terrible people, and they're stupid and uneducated. And this is a worldview that's been perpetuated for a reason, and it's a real genocidal worldview. And I think agrarian rural people are awesome, and we should try to support them. And I'm not saying everybody should move to a rural area. Like, you know, if you like living in cities, it's all good, but you know, support local farmers, and don't buy into the propaganda that all rural people are stupid idiot hicks.
I should mention real quick that me and Marcus are good friends with Phil Collins, aren't we?
We are. And his greatest hits, you know.
Yeah, and all his greatest hits, yeah. Mottfish Flake says, according to my high school marine bio textbook, manatees taste like veal. So there we go. It's got a gamey taste on it. Toddman67 has just sent 3 different super chats with no actual message, but thank you very much, Todd. It means so much. Now he actually does send a message. He says, Joel wants to create a new politic. You want to achieve a political objective. Suggest reading MCDP 1.1 strategy. Okay, sure. Meaty Spartan guy says, during Lent, the Orthodox also fast from olive oil on most days. Lent is really tough, and the meatless agenda wants it year round. I miss meat, bros. He's going to be still in Lent. James Carter says, this is for the Marvel stream. I repeat, this is for the Marvel stream. By the way, I've worked in the health and fitness industry for 18 years. It's all nonsense. Marcelo Frigo says, is rice bad? And what are the proportions of these foods that we should eat?
No, rice isn't bad. And the proportions, I mean, it's going to be situationally dependent, right? I mean, there are healthy populations that eat mostly sweet potatoes, like the Katawans and some of these people in Papua New Guinea. they're living off mostly tubers, But so yeah, no food. Rice is not inherently bad, but I mean, if you're eating nothing but rice, you're gonna be nutrient deficient. But yeah,
Also,
rice.
also it's worth taking into account too, like the quality of foods that go along with it, and also food activity. Tristan, correct me if I'm wrong. 'Cause I'm sure you probably know about the Okinawa study. Would that be right to say? You know about the Okinawa study?
Yeah. Not Ansel Keys, but Denise Minger did a really great breakdown of the China studies that we were talking about.
Oh, so Okinawa, right? They have the highest rate, I think, alongside Corfu and like one village in southern Italy and whatever, of people who either reach 80, 90, or 100, right?
Yeah, but
highest proportion
this
of
was
people.
post World War II that they did this study, and this was after
Yeah.
the U.S. military killed all their swine, which they were eating a lot of swine up
Yeah.
until that.
That's perfectly valid, yeah. But even up until recent times, like Okinawa had the highest rate of people who are reaching these age brackets, right? But then compared to their grandkids who had obesity levels higher than that of the average American kid their age. So their parents lived on a diet of, like you say, swine before they were destroyed. Lots of fish, lots of fresh seafood. For anyone who's familiar with Japanese cuisine, a lot of sashimi, a lot of fresh fish, and it's a very fundamental part of their island culinary culture, and obviously a lot of rice. That's how they bulk out all their food. But what did the elderly people of Okinawa do? They gardened, they fished, they reared animals to what degree they could. They were physically active. So certainly, if you're a fit and healthy person, and carbohydrates and healthy carbohydrates are a component to your diet, and you burn off the glycogen that is in your liver, and you don't create adipose tissue by overfeeding, sure, it absolutely is. But the thing is, when you add all the stuff we've been talking about today, high fructose corn syrup, seed oils, and we've barely even touched on lifestyle, but sitting in a skyscraper for 14 hours of your life, sitting at a desk, being sedentary and typing on a keyboard and staring at a screen and getting your face, pulverized with blue light. You add all this, sitting in peak hour traffic for 2 hours and being chronically depressed, and then going home and eating Uber Eats. Like, of course, you're going to be either skinny fat or fat obese, and this is the disparity between those old Okinawans who were true to their ancestral way of living, which did include a strong proportion of carbohydrates, and then their grandkids who ate McDonald's and Pizza Hut. Like, there you go.
Yeah. Selfish Neuron says, Tucker Goodridge yelling stop. Oh, I should mention, by the way, when my brain didn't function for a moment, I read veal as venison in my mind for some reason. So when I said gamey, I was thinking of like deer meat, not like a veal is a calf meat, isn't it?
Veal is just a baby cow, up to,
calf,
I think, a year and a half. But I do have to agree with D. Veal, sorry, I made that same mistake just then. Venison raised properly and cooked properly is actually an excellent meat. And if you haven't tried venison and you're near a restaurant that does it, I suggest trying venison. It is a wonderful meat.
Selfish Neuron says Tucker Goodrich yelling stop and Brad Marshall fire in a bottle. Seed oils allow high margins for processed foods, and the cathedral loves to virtue signal animal rights and climate change. Money and the Feelies push this. Monothalma says excellent stream and panel. It's hilarious that you could guess Tristan's political leaning by his 10 out of 10 skull shape. Deep dive on the med pill when.
Physiognomy doesn't lie, right?
I didn't pass someone's physiognomy test. It's all lighting and angles, bro. If I come up to you like this, yes, physiognomy test this.
You might not know this, Tristan, but I'm actually an expert on physiognomy. You have an honest chin, honest nose, honest forehead. So yeah, you passed my test.
I'm going to thank my plastic surgeon for that.
Martial Law says, do the guests have any information on the long-term negative effects of smoking weed that goes beyond the stereotype of the basement dwelling midwit? Any insights on weed?
I mean, speaking from experience, I know that weed made me lazy, depressed, and yeah, for me, it was a huge waste of time. And I always would justify, oh no, it's cool. Like, I'm helping myself. It opens my mind. It helps me relax. It helps my anxiety. Yeah, I think it could be really problematic. I'm not saying there's no medicinal use or anything, but me personally, I would say that the stereotype's relatively true. And I do avoid now, but Yeah, that's all I'll say about that.
So there we go. I mean, one thing about smoking weed and food, of course, is that it will give you the munchies, so it will make you eat more because you always get the munchies after getting old. Certainly, I did whenever I smoked them.
And those type of cravings tend to be of the more unhealthy kind. Like you tend to crave, like, you don't smoke weed and go, oh, I really want a T-bone steak. It's like, no, I want,
No,
like twisties
crisp.
or Twix
It'd
or
be
something,
crisps.
crisp. Yeah.
Crisps. Yeah.
Yeah.
Power Chat says, I saw your dissident vid. Out of interest, when it comes to the 4 million or so in the UK who have not been jabbed, was it broken down racially? I remember you guys chatting about that a few weeks ago. There were a lot of racial breakdowns, but I thought that, I mean, without wishing to stereotype too much, how can I say, in my experience and by opinion polls and things, those sorts of people tend not to care that much about things like Russia, Ukraine. So I can't imagine in that 42% of the unvaxxed that I was looking that there were that many, for example, I don't know, like black guys in New York who had really strong views on whether Vladimir Putin is a Nazi or not.
I think when I've seen the stats, blacks in the U.S. tend to be less vaccinated and also have less trust in the government.
Yes. So so what I'm saying is that yes, they were in there were a lot of non-whites in the unvaxxed population, but if you because I was using this multiplier with stance on the Ukraine-Russia thing, like, okay, there could be you could find a black guy who is unvaxxed and not like explicitly pro-Ukraine, but in my experience they just tend not they just don't care about that sort of stuff because it doesn't how can I put it, like, I mean,
enter their radar of concern, so to speak.
Well, I mean, let's just put it a different way. I saw Black Twitter the other day on the Ukraine front, basically saying, like, why should we care about this? They're all white people killing each other.
Sam Hyde made a funny tweet like a couple weeks ago. It was like, him like making some funny, cute face, and his face was clean shaven. It's like, why should I care about white folks with an X in Ukraine when cops out here killing millions of black folk every day or something like that? It was, kind of BLM style. Tweet.
I mean, the only complication I will say is that Europe has a sizable Muslim population who probably have probably one, over-indexed in unvaxxed, and two, because of the neocon wars, have an orientation against the Empire of Lies because of Israel, because of Iraq, because of all of the stuff, Syria, and all the stuff they've done.
Arab Spring, Libya, etc.
Yeah,
they'd be oriented against NATO and Europe, what they would interpret as European imperialism and meddling.
But in the way I think, and in the metrics, I would count them in the dissident population. Yes, they are dissident. They are clearly not for this government. Now, okay, they may not ally with us, but basically they've got the same view on those two questions, right?
I'd agree with that.
So, and like, I mean, there's other issues there. Obviously, it's more complicated than that. But I see less of a direct problem with including, I don't know, like Turks living in Germany as part of the dissident population of Germany. Well, I mean, clearly they are when it comes to supporting the government willy-nilly, Anyway,
like it gives a good opportunity for the regime to kind of lump all these different groups together under, some umbrella of, they're bad extremists who disagree with, they're Putinites, right? Like, so you can lump, the Arabs, the dangerous evil whiteys who are out there just doing all the terrorism. They lump them all together.
Yeah, there's a well-known guy who was a British nationalist back in 2010, 2008 even. He made a speech where he basically said that the system is terrified of two groups: fundamentalist Muslims and quote unquote the far right. And now there's a vector that you could finally tie those two groups together. They already started doing it when George W. Bush, if you remember, said that white nationalists in America are as grave a threat as ISIS. Do you remember he said that? They're as
I do remember that.
They're as un-American as ISIS. Okay, and you know that these people will not differentiate between, let's say, Richard Spencer and any of us sitting on this panel. They just don't care. They're just like, well, you're against us, so we're going to call you a fascist.
According to them, we're all Hassan Nasrallah, right? You know,
right. I mean, and it doesn't, like, they literally don't differentiate. It doesn't matter, for example, that Richard Spencer is both vaxxed and pro-Ukraine. Those sorts of things,
a Ukrainian flag on his Twitter.
It just doesn't matter. You know, they'll pull up an old quote of his or whatever. You know,
or that footage of him getting like clocked on camera. You know, mid-speech.
But that's ultimately what they want to do, is a package that ties together their two main threats, because they do face a genuine threat from Islam. Okay, and like ideally they want to get all of the Tory boys, all of the centre right voters, all of the GOP voters oriented against the Islamic threat, like they were in the mid 2000s, in the early 2000s during the Iraq War, and against the far right threat, quote unquote. And then,
or does any kind of reactionary kind of orientation?
I have noticed. I mean, just in our circles, they have driven a wedge between establishment right Tory types and us over Ukraine specifically. There's been a very sharp wedge on that issue that has driven, like, even Sargon, right, who's very moderate. He debated Adam and Sitch last night, and they basically, like, you know, it was getting testy because they, you know, they're 100% with the regime, and Sargon's like, well, hold on a second, you know, this is just geopolitical reality, blah blah blah, and it's just like anyone who's got any independent thought is going to be driven into this out group for the regime, you know. So
also maybe there's a sub distinction here to be made, and I mean, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, this is just sort of something I observe in the sort of, you know, amongst what we discuss and the things that get shared and whatever, is that there are people who have arrived at dissident right politics having either come. I'll plot out three groups, because probably the easiest way to do this is that, you know, say like from your angle, you've come from, I would say, like a genuinely centrist libertarian sort of Mises Austrian school position. Is that fair to say? You'd accept that categorization?
Yeah, that was my route in. Yeah.
I'm sort of that, you know, cradle Catholic, you know, sort of always sort of moderately right wing, but, you know, not too sort of fanciful, you know, waved the Australian flag, had a barbecue on Australia Day, you know, sort of supported Afghanistan and Iraq when it happened because I believe the bullshit, etc. But, you know, like not sort of out there, but just sort of, you know, you might say solidly centre right and, you know, whatever, sort of in that frame of normality, right? Who have just realised, okay, the system's actually rotten, and, you know, this is why I'm a dissident, because of these things, right, of these factors. And then those who have actually come from, like, you know, like maybe their parents were Greens, or they've come from like Labour stock, you know, and I'm not pointing him out because I'm sure he might be he watches this channel, but take like Keith as an example, you know, has actually come from the left and become a dissident right person, you know, via the long way around the mountain. And it's almost as if they've managed to drive wedges between those groups, because we've had a different origin point. We've arrived at dissident thinking differently. And then therefore they've been able to find, you know, might say cracks in the concrete and just drive wedges in. And that has actually in some ways been a genius function of their vectors of attack. They've actually managed to, where we, for instance, might have galvanized in like 2016 against Hillary Clinton, or we might have galvanized against, I don't know, some other issue or whatever. Boom. Russia, Ukraine, they found cracks in the thing. On the you know, the jab on the Kuf, found cracks in the thing, and they've actually managed to split us apart. I don't know if that's necessarily true, but that's how I interpret it. But it's interesting how Carl, coming from that sort of lefty position, has actually kind of almost drifted more into our direction. That being said,
yeah, also I say, like, your fundamental orientation has to be not on any single issue, but against the elites per se, because once you understand that, you know, they're walking in lockstep on every issue, you know, even when it comes to something as seemingly niche as this topic we've been talking about today, yet they do walk in lockstep on it, right? It's not like I don't know, like Joe Biden is like massively pro steak and Kamala Harris is team cornflakes. It's like, no, they're all on the same page, even on this issue. So it's like,
exactly.
you know, that's where that's where I would say we will find unity in my message of clear them out. But you know, it's still like they're masters at this. I'm just a bloke who runs a YouTube channel, so you know, what do I know?
Exactly.
All right. Anything you'd like to chill, Tristan?
First of all, hey, thanks a lot for having me on. I really appreciate the conversations. Honored that you would have me on here. Your audience is great. Been watching the chat off and on, and it seems like you got a chat full of chads over there on academic agents. So yeah, I have a YouTube channel. I've got a Rockfin channel as well. The links are down in the description. You can find more of my stuff there. Yeah, check me out over there on Rockfin, where it's uncensored, or on YouTube, where it's highly censored. And again, thank you very much for having me on.
Furious, anything you'd like to filter?
I actually had to take a break from AM today because obviously I had this on. I couldn't do sort of both at the same time, but I will be back on AM as we sort of approach the more of the end of our two sets of video streams we're doing, that being orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationalism, and also Nations of Charlemagne. So I'll be back on that more regularly, which would be fun. Actually, I'm almost sad that Tristan didn't shield Chalk, because I actually bought the stack for Chalk.
I don't want to be overzealous, you know. I mean, I can't throw it out. The shout out to the sponsor, Chalk, chalk.com, CHOQ.com, CHOQ, high quality adaptogens, and for balancing hormones, for turning the chat into Uber chads. So yeah, 50% off with the coupon code BIG50. You get half off over there at chalk.com. And then also 50% more global warming and 50% more bigotry in general guaranteed in your life when you hit up CHOQ.com and use that.
And desoy yourself, right?
Exactly. There you go. Yeah. The system making you destroy yourself, engineering you to destroy your communities and your health. Chalk over there helping you desoy yourself. So yeah, you can hit them up.
Exactly.
A couple of last minute super chats. Sorry, Furious. Steve Pierce.
No, good.
I sent a subscriber super
also,
chat.
Also, XRP Ripple ARM. No, I'm just kidding.
Steve, I bought some Ripple once, and fucking like it like did a nosedive. It lost like 200%. You know.
Yeah, I'm also going to be sending meals to Ukraine, right? So I'm collecting money personally. You can personally send that to my PayPal. I'm sending 6 million meals to Ukraine next month, and I need your money for that. So yeah, we'll be ramping up production on it. It's all going to be soy-based, plant-based, and bug-based for the Ukrainian, for BIPOC. It's going to be for the indigenous, First Nations, and LGBTQIA plus MAPS community of Ukraine.
So somebody's saying I missed a super chat. I can't see any missed super chats. Steve Pierce said I sent a subscriber super chat. Did you see it? Unfortunately, Steve Pierce, I can't see those ones because I just don't see them. I've got a special tab here, and they don't, only the paid ones show up. And if you sent it like an hour ago, it's long lost. So Blood on the Blade said Virgin Weed versus Chad Datura. I don't know what Datura is. Power Chat says best first book to buy on physiognomy. Well, I mean, we did a bit of a meme stream on phrenology with Ed Dutton, where Dutton was drunk famously on Cigar Stream. So it's a bit of a meme, to be honest. But probably the best book to buy on it is by Ed Dutton. It's called How to Judge People by What They Look Like. All sorts of weird things in there. Like if you ever see like a girl with a gap in her teeth, she's probably sexually promiscuous, for example. It's one of the little tidbits from that book. Anyway, buy my courses. I can see people. I can see somebody's just bought Foundations of Politics and Foundations of Research. I hope he gets a lot out of those. Join the channel, subscribe to the Substack, but most importantly of all, get out. I will see you tomorrow for Unpopular Opinions. And in fact, we'll be talking about Christianity and paganism, which was mentioned briefly on this stream on Wednesday's Cigar Stream. Now I'll guess.
Before you quit, actually, with Tristan on board, we have to do the Bowden thing. Clear them
you
out.
want,
Oils.
you want to
Yes.
see it? Okay, all right.
Clear out your cupboards, ladies and gentlemen. Get them out.
Hold on. If Tristan hasn't seen this,
Clear them out. Clear out. Clear them out. You've got to clear them out. You've got to clear them out as well. There needs to be a new start.